You're taught that the leader's inner circle was a group of loyal followers doing whatever he commanded, but that's far from the truth. There were 5 key reasons these people not only enabled him, but amplified his worst ambitions. Each man's loyalty, rivalry, and obsession turned personal ambition into instruments of unimaginable terror. Heinrich Himmler built an empire of death from a bodyguard unit of just 280 men, and at the same time, Joseph Goebbels controlled every newspaper, radio broadcast, and film shown in Germany. Meanwhile, Hermann Göring commanded the Air Force while stealing art worth billions, and alongside him in the power structure, Martin Bormann decided who could speak to Hitler and who couldn't. In addition, Albert Speer organized factories where 12 million people worked like slaves. But the dark truth most documentaries miss is that the leader didn't need to order every crime because his inner circle did something far more dangerous. To win Hitler's favor, they competed to prove their loyalty by building personal empires and pushing policies to the extreme. And here are the questions that haunt historians. How did these 5 men come together in the first place? And how did they go from early party members to the most powerful men in Germany, each commanding his own empire of terror? The answers show something important about how authoritarian groups recruit and radicalize their most dangerous supporters. Hitler didn't meet these men by chance. He chose them carefully, tested their loyalty, and built a system that turned their ambitions into a nightmare for Germany. To see how their fates collided, let's go back to post-war Germany, where the first steps of their rise began to form. Section 1. The Formation. Germany in 1918 was a wreck after World War I ended in a humiliating defeat. About 2 million German soldiers were gone, and the Treaty of Versailles forced Germany to take the blame and pay high costs. The economy collapsed into hyperinflation so severe that people carried money in wheelbarrows just to buy bread. By 1923, a loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January required 200 billion marks by November, according to historical and economic accounts. Life savings became worthless overnight, and middle-class families lost everything. Political violence erupted in the streets as different groups fought for control, with communist revolutionaries clashing against nationalist militias, while the government struggled to maintain order. Many Germans felt betrayed by their own leaders for signing the armistice, adding even more tension to an already unstable situation. But the military defeat seemed impossible to accept, especially since Germany's army had still been fighting on foreign soil when the war ended. As a result, many soldiers believed they had been stabbed in the back by politicians and civilians rather than defeated by enemy forces. This chaos created the perfect conditions for Adolf, the leader's rise. Although he was just another angry veteran in 1919, bitter about Germany's defeat, he soon found a new outlet when he joined a tiny political group in Munich called the German Workers' Party. Despite having fewer than 100 members when he arrived, the group became the starting point of his transformation. That's when Hitler discovered he had a gift for public speaking. When he spoke in beer halls about Germany's humiliation and the need for striking back, people listened as his audiences grew larger with every speech. Historian Ian Kershaw explained that these early rallies slowly turned him from a fringe agitator into a magnetic public figure, and the growing crowds made his message stronger while more men gathered around him. These were not random followers drawn in by his presence alone, since he was carefully choosing the people he wanted closest to him. He wanted men who showed complete personal devotion to him, shared his extreme nationalist and racial beliefs without hesitation, and had skills he could use as he tried to build influence. Above all, he demanded obedience with no room for questions. The leader was not simply building a political party, because he was shaping a loyal circle that would follow him at every step and carry out his decisions without resistance. Each man went through a close evaluation before being accepted into this inner group. This selection process shows how authoritarian movements identify and develop the people who help them rise. And it also shows how his trusted circle later strengthened his harshest plans until they formed a well-organized system of cruelty. The situation in Germany after World War I created conditions where extremist movements could flourish. Historical records document that political instability was constant throughout the early 1920s, and the new democratic government known as the Weimar Republic struggled as pressure came from both the left and the right. Communist groups attempted revolution as they hoped to establish a Soviet-style government, and uprisings in Berlin and Munich in 1919 were put down with force. Meanwhile, nationalist groups rejected democracy entirely and pushed for a return to strict one-man rule. Economic conditions made everything worse, since the Treaty of Versailles required Germany to pay enormous reparations to the Allied powers. These payments reached 132 billion gold marks, which was about 3 times the country's yearly economic output and far beyond what Germany could manage. Germany could not pay such amounts while trying to rebuild its broken economy, so the government printed more money in an attempt to meet its obligations, and this step-by-step process set off hyperinflation that destroyed the value of the currency and wiped away the savings of millions of families. Historical accounts describe people using worthless paper money to cover their walls because it cost less than real wallpaper, and workers often wanted payment twice a day since their wages lost value within hours. The middle class, which had long been the backbone of German society, saw its sense of stability collapse. This created deep resentment against the Weimar government. Many Germans blamed democratic politicians for signing the Treaty of Versailles, and they saw the acceptance of war guilt and reparations as a deep national betrayal. Nationalist groups promised to restore Germany's honor and power, which helped them gain more support during this troubled period. Political violence became routine, and the killing of government officials happened often, while street battles between communist and nationalist groups were common in major cities. Because of this constant unrest, the government appeared unable to maintain order or give even basic security to the public. Into this chaos stepped Adolf Hitler, at first only one voice among many angry nationalists. He had served in World War I as a corporal in the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment, and he earned the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, a rare award for someone of his rank that gave him military standing. In October 1918, a British gas attack temporarily blinded him and sent him to Passawalk Military Hospital, and he was still recovering when Germany surrendered on November 10, 1918. Historical accounts describe this as a pivotal moment in the leader's personal mythology. In his later telling, this experience pushed him toward politics as he claimed he wanted to restore Germany's strength, and whether this story was true or partly shaped afterward matters less than what it shows about his self-image. He saw himself as a man with a historic mission born from national humiliation, and this belief guided many of his later choices. And to start his historic political career, Hitler joined the German Workers' Party in September 1919. The party was tiny and insignificant, meeting in Munich beer halls with small audiences, yet Hitler quickly became its strongest speaker as his talks began drawing larger crowds. His message about Germany's betrayal and the need for revenge connected with listeners who were already frustrated and angry. According to Kershaw, Hitler soon took charge of the party's propaganda work in early 1920, and he renamed it the National Socialist German Workers' Party, known as the NSDAP. He also created the swastika flag and selected the symbols and colors that defined the group's identity. By 1921, he had positioned himself as the party's unquestioned leader, demanding and receiving full control over its direction. This was not a democratic organization with shared leadership because it functioned as his personal tool from the start. The party grew steadily during the early 1920s, and membership rose from a few hundred to several thousand. The message appealed to Germans who felt humiliated by defeat, threatened by communist revolution, and let down by democratic politicians who they believed had failed them. But the leader understood that speeches alone were not enough, since real political success needed skilled men who could organize, plan, and take action. He needed specialists who could manage specific tasks, and he wanted complete loyalty from people who had real abilities that could help him rise further. That's when he began systematically identifying and recruiting these men. Hitler did not build his inner circle through accident or friendship, since he used a clear system to choose the men who would serve him without question. This approach shows how authoritarian movements identify and shape their most dangerous enablers. The first criterion was absolute personal devotion, and he often tested potential members by giving them difficult tasks to see how they reacted. He measured their enthusiasm through actions rather than words, and only those who proved themselves through real effort earned his trust. The second criterion was shared beliefs, because the leader wanted men who truly accepted extreme nationalism and racial theories. Opportunists could have short-term value, yet only genuine believers stayed committed when conditions became difficult. The third criterion was useful skills. Hitler looked for people with specific abilities, which meant he wanted someone who could organize a paramilitary force, someone who understood propaganda, and someone who could manage day-to-day administration. Each recruit offered something distinct. The fourth criterion was a willingness to use force, since he understood that political power in the chaotic Weimar Republic often depended on physical action. He wanted men who would not hesitate to intimidate opponents, join street fights, or take part in unlawful acts when ordered. Historians Richard Evans and Ian Kershaw explain that the leader applied these criteria step by step, giving potential members more serious duties and watching how they handled responsibility. He noted who stayed loyal during setbacks and who began to waver, and these observations shaped his final choices for the inner circle. This created a selection pressure favoring extremism. Men who suggested moderation appeared weak, and anyone who questioned orders seemed disloyal, which meant the inner circle attracted people who showed commitment through actions that grew more radical over time. The men who would become Hitler's inner circle came from very different backgrounds, ranging from educated intellectuals with university degrees to street fighters who had criminal records. Some had military experience from World War I, while others had never worn a uniform, yet they were drawn together by shared beliefs. They felt Germany had been betrayed and humiliated, and they blamed specific groups for this, especially Jews and communists, while also believing that violence was an acceptable political tool. They saw in the leader someone who they thought could restore Germany's strength, which made them even more willing to follow him. Most importantly, they were ready to set aside their own ambitions and accept Hitler's authority completely. They did not try to build independent power or challenge his choices, and their loyalty was directed toward him personally rather than toward any principles or party programs. This combination made them effective tools for the leader's aims. They had the skills to carry out important tasks, and the beliefs that justified extreme actions, as well as the loyalty to follow orders without hesitation and the willingness to use force without moral restraint. And each early loyalist gained the Führer's trust through different paths. Heinrich, the SS chief, seemed an unlikely figure for major power, since he was physically unimpressive, only about 5'7" with poor eyesight requiring thick glasses, and he often appeared socially awkward without the presence of stronger personalities. Before joining the party, he had even failed at chicken farming, and Evans and Kershaw describe him as methodical and orderly, but not successful in business. And although other members mocked his odd habits, Hitler noticed traits that others ignored, traits that later proved deadly. What Hitler saw was Himmler's capacity for complete devotion mixed with strong organizational skill, and the SS chief viewed the leader with near religious belief, and evidence from his diaries shows this loyalty was genuine rather than flattery. More importantly for Hitler, Himmler had a careful mind able to turn vague ideas into systems, and when the leader spoke in broad terms about racial purity, Himmler began drafting concrete plans, and when Hitler mentioned needing a loyal guard, Himmler started shaping what became the SS. According to historian Evans, in 1929, the leader appointed Himmler to lead the Schutzstaffel, or protection squadron. At the time, the SS was only a small bodyguard unit of 280 men and remained under the larger SA, the brown-shirted street fighters commanded by Ernst Rohm. Himmler immediately began transforming the SS with fanatic dedication. He personally interviewed every new member, and he created strict racial and physical requirements that all applicants had to meet. He designed elaborate ceremonies and distinctive black uniforms, which made SS members feel special and set apart from ordinary party members. Within just a few years, Himmler transformed the tiny unit of 280 men into a powerful organization with thousands of members, and the SS set stricter standards than the SA, demanding proof of Aryan ancestry going back generations, higher physical abilities, and more intensive training. Evidence shows the SS chief established membership rules, including minimum height requirements, specific facial features, and extensive documentation of family lineage, so anyone who could not prove their racial purity was rejected, no matter their skills or experience. This exclusivity created a strong group identity, and SS members saw themselves as a racial elite who believed they were Germany's most loyal and capable defenders. This sense of superiority made them willing to carry out actions that others might question. His reward for loyalty and competence was steadily increasing authority, as Hitler gave Himmler more responsibility with every success, which brought more resources and expanded his power, creating a clear pattern where absolute devotion combined with administrative skill led to greater influence. Himmler proved what Hitler valued most. You did not need to be charismatic or impressive, but you did need to be completely devoted and effective in carrying out the leader's vision, and the SS chief exemplified these qualities perfectly. His awkward manner and failed business ventures did not matter because his organizational skills and absolute loyalty made him indispensable, but Himmler wasn't the only intellectual drawn to Hitler's movement. Another educated man would prove even more effective at shaping public opinion and influencing mass psychology. Joseph Goebbels came to the leader as a failed writer and intellectual, searching for meaning and recognition, and he found a cause that consumed him completely while giving him the propaganda skills to promote Hitler's most extreme visions. Goebbels had earned a doctorate in literature from Heidelberg University in 1921, and Kershaw notes that his dissertation focused on 19th century romantic drama. He had literary ambitions and saw himself as an artist and intellectual, yet the cultural establishment rejected him. He had written plays, poems, and novels, but publishers refused his work repeatedly, and theaters would not stage his plays, leaving him without a place in the literary world. He also carried deep resentment over a clubfoot from childhood that left him with a permanent limp, and this physical disability, combined with professional failures, created a lasting bitterness, as he believed Germany's cultural elite had unfairly excluded him. When Goebbels discovered the party in the mid-1920s, he finally found purpose. Yet it is telling about the leader's skill in manipulation that Goebbels did not start out fully loyal to Hitler, since he initially supported a different faction led by Gregor Strasser, but Hitler knew about Goebbels' divided loyalty. Instead of pushing the propaganda chief aside, Hitler worked to win him over by inviting Goebbels to meetings, praising his writing, and giving him the appreciation he never received from the cultural world. Through this steady attention, Hitler turned Goebbels into one of his most devoted followers, and Evans and Kershaw note that by 1926, the change was complete, with Goebbels writing diary entries that showed near worship. His private notes, preserved in archives, described Hitler as a genius guided by fate, and Goebbels pledged loyalty that would never break, expressing a devotion that often felt closer to faith than politics. More importantly for Hitler, the propaganda chief had a strong instinct for shaping public opinion because he used emotional appeals, relied on simple messages repeated often, and framed party beliefs in ways ordinary Germans accepted easily. The dictator understood that shaping public opinion was vital for gaining and keeping authority, and Goebbels became the ideal figure for this job by mixing intense belief with a sharp sense of mass psychology. According to historian Evans, Hitler gradually gave Goebbels more responsibility over party communications, so that by 1926 he was writing and editing party publications. And by 1928, he managed propaganda for the entire Berlin region, with every speech, poster, and article passing through him or following his guidelines. Goebbels proved his worth through clever propaganda campaigns that helped the Nazis win more votes. This made him invaluable to Hitler, as others focused on organization or force, while Goebbels shaped how Germans understood politics, crafted the mythology of the leader as Germany's savior, justified party policies, and used emotions to overcome rational objections. The relationship between Hitler and Goebbels reveals the leader's skill at manipulation, since he recognized Goebbels' desperate need for validation, provided it strategically, and converted a potential rival into his most devoted follower by meeting psychological needs that the cultural establishment had ignored. But Hitler needed more than organizers and propagandists, since the violent politics of Weimar Germany also required muscle. He needed men willing to use physical force against political opponents. Ernst Rohm provided Hitler with something different but just as essential, since he commanded the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the party's paramilitary force of brown-shirted street fighters that gave the party muscle in the early years when political power often came from controlling the streets. Rohm was a tough military veteran who had served in World War I, and he believed in revolutionary nationalism, thinking Germany needed to be completely remade through force, with a vision in some ways more radical than Hitler's, aiming for a full transformation of German society. The SA that Rohm led protected party gatherings from disruption, intimidated opponents, and prevented them from organizing effectively, while also engaging in street battles with communist paramilitaries for control of working-class neighborhoods, providing the physical security needed for political organizing. Historical evidence documents the SA's crucial role in the party's growth, because without its violence and intimidation, party rallies would have been disrupted. Speakers shouted down or attacked, and the party might never have survived the chaotic street politics of Weimar Germany. Rohm's SA gave Hitler the physical force he needed to build his movement. By the early 1930s, the brown-shirted fighters numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and they were organized like a military force, complete with uniforms, ranks, and command structures, functioning as a private army loyal to the party rather than to the German state. Rohm himself was loyal to Hitler personally, having known him since the early 1920s and supported him through multiple political crises. When Hitler attempted to seize power in the beer hall putsch of November 1923, Rohm participated and was wounded during the attempt, demonstrating his willingness to risk personal harm for the cause. After the putsch failed, Rohm went into temporary exile in Bolivia, only returning to Germany when Hitler called him back to reorganize the SA, which showed his loyalty to the leader above all else. However, Rohm's relationship with Hitler was more complicated than that of other inner circle members, since he saw himself as a comrade and peer rather than a subordinate, having been with Hitler from the beginning and commanding significant independent power through the SA, while also speaking to him more informally than others. This independence would eventually make him dangerous in the leader's eyes, but in the early years, Rohm's SA was essential to the party's success, because the movement needed street fighters before it needed administrators or bureaucrats, and Rohm provided those fighters and led them effectively. The SA's violence served multiple purposes. By 1933, the SA had grown to over 3 million members, vastly outnumbering Germany's regular army, which the Treaty of Versailles limited to just 100,000 men, giving Hitler enormous leverage in political negotiations and intimidating potential opponents. At the same time, Hitler was cultivating relationships with more respectable figures who could give the party legitimacy beyond the influence of street violence. One such figure would bring military credibility and social respectability. Hermann, the Air Force chief, brought something the party desperately needed in its early years, and those were military credibility and social respectability, since he was a genuine World War I hero, a fighter pilot who had shot down 22 enemy planes and commanded Germany's most famous squadron. Goering came from an aristocratic family with ties to Germany's upper classes, as his father had been a colonial administrator and diplomat, and Goering himself had grown up in castles and moved in elite social circles, which gave him access to people who would not have listened to Hitler or other party leaders. When the Air Force chief joined the party in 1922, he provided the movement with something something it had lacked because people who might have dismissed Hitler as a rabble-rouser took the party more seriously upon seeing a decorated war hero like Goering supporting it. According to Kershaw, Goering used his social connections to raise money for the party and introduce Hitler to wealthy donors, bringing respectability to a movement many Germans had long seen as thuggish and extreme, and signaling that the Nazis were no longer just street fighters, but a rising political force. The Air Force chief also proved his loyalty through violence and sacrifice. In 1923, when Hitler attempted to seize power through the beer hall putsch, Goering was beside him, and when police opened fire on the party march through Munich, he was seriously wounded by a bullet in the groin, which caused lasting pain and permanent injury. He had to flee Germany to avoid arrest after the failed putsch, spending years in exile, first in Austria and then in Sweden, and during his recovery from the wound, he became dependent on morphine that doctors had prescribed for pain, struggling through difficult times and gaining weight. But he never betrayed Hitler or the party, and that loyalty during hardship earned him a permanent place in the leader's inner circle, so that when Hitler was released from prison and rebuilt the party, Goering was welcomed back and given important positions. Historical evidence confirms Goering's military credentials were genuine, as his 22 aerial victories in World War I were verified. His command of the famous Richthofen Squadron after the Red Baron's death was real, and he was decorated with the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. This military prestige proved invaluable for the party because it helped convince many Germans, especially veterans and conservatives, that the Nazis were not just revolutionary radicals, but patriotic nationalists aiming to restore Germany's military honor. The Air Force chief's personality differed dramatically from the SS chief's earnest fanaticism or the propaganda chief's intellectual intensity. Goering was hedonistic and fond of luxury, enjoying hunting, collecting art, and displays of wealth, while lacking the ideological commitment that drove Himmler or Goebbels, and appearing motivated more by opportunity, power, and personal enrichment. But this did not make him less valuable to Hitler, because Goering served different purposes than the true believers. His social connections gave access to money and influential people. His military reputation lent credibility with conservatives and veterans, and his readiness to use force showed he would do whatever Hitler required. Each of these men offered the leader something he needed, with Himmler providing organizational genius and absolute devotion, Goebbels offering propaganda skill and ideological fanaticism, Rohm supplying paramilitary muscle and street fighting ability, and Goering contributing military credibility and social connections. Their characters and ambitions were completely different, yet they all served Hitler's purposes, demonstrated absolute loyalty when tested, and proved willing to commit illegal acts and use force when ordered. By the early 1930s, the leader had assembled a powerful inner circle where each member commanded his own domain, had proven his loyalty and usefulness, and brought specific skills to the growing party movement. But the inner circle's structure was about to be tested in the most dramatic way possible. By 1934, a crisis was building that would define how the inner circle operated for years to come, because Hitler had been Germany's leader for about a year and a half, achieving power through elections, political maneuvering, and intimidation, yet now faced a serious problem with the organization that had helped him rise. Rohm's SA had grown to over 3 million members, making it larger than Germany's regular army, which the Treaty of Versailles limited to just 100,000 men, and creating tension over the paramilitary forces' role. Rohm was giving speeches about continuing the party revolution, suggesting that the SA might take over or merge with the military, and envisioning a people's army that could fundamentally transform German society. Germany's professional army generals grew extremely nervous about this development, seeing the SA as a threat to their institutional power and professional identity, and making it clear to Hitler that they would not support him if he allowed the SA to challenge the regular military. The leader faced a difficult choice because he needed the support of the traditional military to secure his power and pursue long-term goals of rearmament and war, as the generals commanded the professional expertise and resources necessary to build a modern military. But Rohm was an old friend who had been with him from the beginning. The SA had helped Hitler rise to power through years of street fighting, and Rohm was one of the few people who addressed Hitler informally with the familiar "du" rather than the formal "Sie," which meant their relationship went back over a decade and gave Rohm a unique influence in the party. According to Kershaw, Hitler made his decision quickly and brutally, ordering a purge of the SA leadership on June 30, 1934, an operation that became known as the Night of the Long Knives and would define the inner circle's loyalty and structure. SS troops under the SS chief's command and regular army units carried out the operation, arresting Rohm and dozens of other SA leaders across Germany, and while many were shot immediately without trial, others were imprisoned briefly before being killed. Rohm was shot in his cell on July 1st after he refused to commit self-harm when given the opportunity, and over the next several days, the purge spread beyond just SA leaders as Hitler took the chance to remove other potential opponents and settle old scores. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 85 people were killed during the purge, although some historians believe the number reached several hundred, and the exact total remains uncertain because many bodies were disposed of secretly and records were purposefully destroyed. The Night of the Long Knives wasn't just a political purge. It was the leader's message to his inner circle and to all party officials that he would eliminate anyone, no matter how loyal, no matter how long their service, especially if they threatened his authority. And the lesson was learned thoroughly by those who survived. The purge sent a crystal clear message showing that loyalty alone was not enough to guarantee survival. As Kershaw notes, even Rohm, who had been with Hitler from the very beginning, who had fought beside him and shared prison after the beer hall putsch, could be eliminated without hesitation if Hitler perceived him as a threat. No one was truly safe, and no past service could guarantee future protection. Only current usefulness and complete submission to the leader's authority mattered, which meant that the purge demonstrated Hitler's willingness to remove even his oldest friends and comrades if they stood in his way. This created an atmosphere of fear and competition that would characterize the inner circle from that moment forward, so every member understood they survived only as long as they remained useful and absolutely loyal, and any hint of independent power or questioning of the leader's decisions could be fatal. The purge also showed the system that Hitler was purposely creating. Himmler and the Air Force chief had actively encouraged Hitler to move against Rome, and they had provided intelligence about supposed SA plots against the leader, while volunteering their forces to carry out the killings. They had competed to prove themselves more loyal and useful than Rome, which showed how personal ambition and strategic calculation shaped the inner circle. Why would they do this? The answer was simple and harsh. Eliminating Rome and weakening the SA increased their own power. The SS chief's SS could expand into the space left by the diminished SA, while Goering could strengthen his position by helping remove a rival, as noted by Kershaw. The inner circle members were already competing with each other for the leader's favor and for influence within the party system, and Hitler was using that competition intentionally to maintain control. He had set them against each other on purpose, making loyalty and usefulness the ultimate currency in the party hierarchy. After the purge, the real structure of party power became clear. Hitler did not want a unified chain of command with clear hierarchies and defined responsibilities. Instead, he preferred personal empires that competed for his favor, and that competition would push the Third Reich toward increasingly radical policies. The Night of the Long Knives established the operating principles for Hitler's inner circle: compete to prove your loyalty, demonstrate usefulness through extreme action, never question the leader's authority, and recognize that no one was safe if they threatened his power. These principles would govern the inner circle for the next 11 years until the regime's final collapse. Hitler now began formally assigning portfolios and building the system that would define the regime. After the purge, he gave each inner circle member specific domains of authority, but he did something unusual on purpose by never clearly defining where one man's authority ended and another's began. This was not accidental or poor management. It was the leader's strategy for maintaining total control, because as long as his inner circle competed for his approval, none of them could challenge his power, and that competition pushed the regime toward policies that became more and more deadly. The formation of the inner circle was complete. Each man had been selected, tested, and proven. Each had his domain and ambitions, and each understood the rules of survival, which were absolute loyalty, continuous competition, and demonstrating commitment through extreme action. However, selection and position alone were not enough to explain what would come next. These men brought their own beliefs, obsessions, and ideologies to their roles, and while Hitler provided the framework, each inner circle member interpreted and intensified party beliefs in his own way. Knowing what they believed is essential to understanding what they did, because these beliefs were not just surface decorations, but shaped the actions that defined the regime. It was the engine that drove their actions, justified their crimes, and transformed personal ambition into systematic abuse and cruelty, rooted in the idea of a superior race. Section 2. The ideology. The men surrounding Hitler weren't randomly selected. They shared something deeper than loyalty or ambition. They believed in a specific worldview that shaped every decision they made. This belief system is essential to why they acted as they did. Why did they follow the leader to the end? Why did they commit crimes that seem incomprehensible to ordinary people? This wasn't a traditional political program with policies that could be debated or modified. It was a complete vision of how the world worked. It explained everything, and it demanded total commitment. At the core of party beliefs stood one central belief that explained everything else. The world was imagined as divided into superior and inferior races, locked in an eternal struggle for survival. This idea was not presented as an opinion, but as a scientific fact, described as a natural law governing human existence, much like gravity governs falling objects. According to Richard Evans, party theorists claimed races were fundamentally different in ability, character, and worth. They argued that these differences could not be changed through education or environment, and were instead permanent biological realities. At the top of this constructed hierarchy stood the Aryan race, identified primarily with Germanic peoples. Party teachings claimed that Aryans had created all great civilizations and possessed unique qualities of intelligence, creativity, and strength that distinguished them from all others. Evidence from party educational materials shows that this worldview was taught systematically. School textbooks included elaborate charts depicting racial hierarchies, and students were instructed to measure skulls and classify facial features, learning to identify racial characteristics before mastering algebra or chemistry. Below the Aryans in this fabricated ranking came other European populations, with Slavic peoples classified as inferior and suited primarily for labor under German supervision. According to party ideology, Slavs lacked the capacity for self-government or cultural achievement, and their proper role was serving German masters rather than ruling themselves. But there was one group placed even lower. At the bottom of this racist hierarchy, party beliefs placed Jews, and this was not religious prejudice that conversion could fix, since Evans explains that the party defined Jewishness as racial, permanent, and unchangeable. By this logic, Jews represented an existential threat to all other peoples, especially Aryans, and Kershaw notes that party theorists described Jews as parasites who weakened host nations from within and lacked creative ability, surviving only by exploiting others. This ideology went far beyond traditional hatred, since party teachings claimed Jews worked through deliberate conspiracy, supposedly controlling international finance, influencing governments, spreading harmful ideas, and weakening racial purity through intermarriage. Hitler's inner circle accepted these ideas as fundamental truth, and evidence from private diaries, letters, and recorded conversations shows Himmler, Goebbels, Heinrich, and Bormann genuinely embraced these beliefs, not just for career gain. Goebbels's diary, cited by Kershaw, reveals his constant fixation on alleged Jewish plots, even in private notes never meant for publication. And Evans shows that Himmler's correspondence displayed the same conviction, with frequent references to racial purity and Aryan superiority as unquestioned facts. This shared worldview created strong bonds among the leadership, since they saw themselves as people who understood hidden racial truths while others remained blind. And this self-image as guardians of truth justified any action they believed necessary in defense of their racial mission. Yet the racial beliefs went beyond abstract theory. The beliefs demanded action based on these supposed racial truths, and if races were locked in a struggle for survival, then Germany had to act aggressively to secure Aryan dominance, since hesitation signaled weakness, and weakness threatened survival, creating constant pressure for more extreme measures. Heinrich Himmler showed how deeply these ideas shaped the inner circle, and as head of the SS, he built an entire organization around these racial principles. The SS required proof of Aryan ancestry for generations, and applicants had to document family trees in detail. And any Jewish or Slavic ancestry meant immediate rejection, no matter how distant. Physical appearance carried great weight, and preference went to tall, blonde, blue-eyed candidates who matched the imagined Aryan ideal, and Evans notes that the SS kept strict physical rules, including height limits and classifications of skull and facial features. Himmler also created breeding programs that encouraged SS men to father children with racially approved women, and these programs, called Lebensborn, offered medical care and financial help for mothers of SS children. He spoke often about forming a new racial elite through selective reproduction and removing groups he considered inferior, and these were not casual thoughts but organized programs receiving strong support. Evans writes that Himmler truly believed the SS was shaping a new racial aristocracy, and he studied obscure theories about ancient Germanic tribes until he convinced himself the SS was restoring old warrior traditions, and his commitment to these beliefs was nothing but absolute. This commitment shaped every decision Himmler made as one of the most powerful men in the regime. When he expanded the camp system, he saw it as protecting racial policies, and when he organized mass killings of targeted groups, he viewed these measures as defending the Aryan race against existential threats. Reinhard Heydrich, the SS chief's deputy, approached racial beliefs with colder calculation but equal commitment. The security chief organized the systematic documentation of Jewish populations across Europe, and his agencies created detailed card files tracking ancestry, property, and locations. This bureaucratic machinery prepared the way for later operations by identifying people and planning logistics. According to Richard Evans, Heydrich treated racial policy as a technical challenge requiring efficient solutions, and he applied extraordinary organizational skill to implementing these beliefs. While others spoke of racial struggle, Heydrich created the systems that translated ideology into practical action, and his combination of fanatic commitment and bureaucratic genius made him exceptionally dangerous. Still, not everyone in the inner circle was an ideological true believer. Hermann Göring showed opportunism most clearly, and evidence suggests the Air Force chief cared more about power, wealth, and comfort than about racial theory or ideological purity. He gained large art collections through theft, built lavish estates, and hosted guests with displays of luxury that embarrassed other leaders. And Kershaw notes his lifestyle resembled that of a Renaissance prince rather than a revolutionary. His anti-Semitism was real, but more traditional and economic than racial, and he joined eagerly in seizing Jewish property, treating harsh measures as a chance for personal enrichment. Private conversations recorded by observers show he found extreme ideological talk dull, often joking about Himmler's mystical interests while showing little interest in racial theory. Evans adds that Göring sometimes protected individual Jews who had business value, and this was not compassion but calculation, since if someone served his interests, he allowed exceptions, while true believers like the SS chief rejected any compromise. However, Albert Speer represented another type within the inner circle. Speer claimed after the war that he focused only on technical matters and ignored beliefs. This version of events was mostly false, yet it still shows something important about how some members of the inner circle related to party beliefs. Documents show that the arms minister accepted the main ideas of party beliefs without thinking deeply about the details. He believed that Germany should be great, and he accepted the idea that the country needed to grow by force. Plus, he even took part in programs that used slave labor without showing moral concern. However, he did not share the fierce commitment that drove Himmler or the propaganda chief. Speer's main loyalty was to the leader as a person, not to the beliefs. He saw the German leader as a genius and devoted himself to turning the leader's building plans and weapons projects into reality. For him, the personal relationship mattered more than any set of ideas. This made the arms minister useful, yet he was less dangerous than the true believers who would have continued the mission even without the leader watching over them. Speer needed the leader's approval and direction, while the true believers needed only the beliefs themselves. Nevertheless, the distinction between believers and opportunists mattered less in practice than it might seem. The regime most often rewarded people who showed their loyalty to its ideas through what they did, not just what they said. Himmler rose to great power because he built organizations that turned racial policy into a daily reality. The security chief became vital to the regime when he built tightly organized systems for the harsh treatment of people the state targeted. Even those who mainly sought personal gain soon saw that they rose fastest when they looked loyal to the ideology. Over time, this pushed the system to favor more extreme figures. Members of the inner circle competed to prove their commitment with ever more radical plans and actions. Anyone who suggested milder policies or basic human kindness risked being seen as weak or even disloyal. As a result, the system lifted the most ruthless people into positions of power and pushed aside those who tried to slow the harm. Meanwhile, Joseph Goebbels demonstrated how beliefs and opportunism could combine in one person. Goebbels was a true believer who joined the party movement when it was still small and powerless, and his early diary entries, as examined by Kershaw, reveal a strong commitment to the party's ideas about race and its revolutionary aims. Years before such views brought him any advantage, he wrote passionately about German destiny and what he saw as a Jewish plot. And these private writings, which he never meant others to read, make his beliefs appear sincere. At the same time, the propaganda chief drove himself forward with fierce ambition and carefully worked his way into the leader's inner circle, since he understood that whoever shaped propaganda could also gain power and respect. His ideological commitment was real, yet it matched his personal ambition so closely that belief and self-interest pushed in the same direction instead of pulling apart. In his book, The Third Reich, historian Michael Burley argues that this mix of faith and ambition was common in the inner circle, since many men could truly accept the beliefs while also seeing that they opened clear paths for promotion. These two motives did not clash but worked together because the beliefs drew in convinced followers while at the same time rewarding opportunists who learned to speak the language of the movement with skill. But the beliefs encompassed more than just racial theories. Party beliefs taught that Germany had to gain much more territory in order to survive. This idea, known as Lebensraum or living space, was just as central to party thinking as its ideas about race. These two beliefs were closely linked since expansion was presented as the natural right of a superior race and as a way to create more room for that race to grow. The argument went like this. Germany was said to be surrounded by weaker peoples who lived on valuable land, and the German race, described as stronger and more deserving, was told it had the right to control this territory. Supporters also claimed that Germany needed more farmland and natural resources to support its people and its economy. Because of this, they said expansion was not simple aggression, but a fair act of self-defense and a step needed for survival. As a result, this belief shaped the whole approach of the Inner Circle to foreign policy and military planning. They did not see expansion as just one choice among many. They saw it as a matter of national life and death that Germany could not avoid. In their minds, failure to expand meant the slow death of the race through hunger and decline. The German leader wrote at length about Lebensraum in his books during the 1920s, and he stated that expansion had to move east into Poland, Ukraine, and Russia, instead of turning to overseas colonies. He insisted that the new land had to lie right next to Germany and that the people already living there had to be removed to make room for German settlers. In this way, his writing was not just vague theory, but a clear plan for future wars of expansion. Therefore, the Inner Circle absorbed these ideas and built their careers on carrying them out. When the SS chief drew up plans for SS settlements in conquered lands, he was working from this same idea. And when Goering oversaw the economic stripping of occupied regions, he also followed this framework. When Heydrich organized the removal of whole communities, he carried out this vision in practice, and records from planning meetings in the late 1930s, as compiled in Hitler and His Generals by Helmut Heiber and Gerhard Weinberg, show that ideas about living space guided nearly every discussion. Military operations were planned with clear goals of seizing farmland and key resources, while administrative systems were set up to support German colonization, and population policies focused on pushing out Slavic residents to open space for German settlers. This was not simply a clever excuse for the usual struggle between great powers, since the Inner Circle truly believed that Germany would fall apart if it failed to gain more living space. These beliefs persuaded them that expansion was a form of self-defense rather than an aggressive choice, and this way of thinking let them chase conquest with little or no moral doubt. The belief that expansion was necessary created a constant sense of urgency that pushed their choices throughout the 1930s. Every year that passed without expansion seemed to leave Germany further behind and weaker, and in their minds, the beliefs called for action sooner rather than later. Still, Lebensraum wasn't just about gaining resources. The concept rested on a vision of a racial empire in which Germans ruled over peoples seen as beneath them. In this vision, the beliefs did not imagine that conquered groups would ever become equal citizens. Instead, it set out a clear order with Germans as masters and Slavs reduced to servants. Slavic communities were expected to provide labor under German control, so they would work on German land, build German roads and buildings, and meet German needs. Heinrich Himmler pushed this vision the furthest with detailed plans for SS settlements in the East. In his book Heinrich Himmler, historian Peter Longerich describes how surviving plans called for creating guarded villages filled with SS families. These new settlements were meant to be the backbone of German rule in the East. SS men would work as both farmers and soldiers, and through this double role, they would keep what the party saw as racial control. Himmler pictured these settlements spreading step by step across conquered lands to the east. Each new generation would move further into areas that party beliefs described as empty space waiting for German farming. The people already living in these areas were to be pushed out, worked until they died, or kept in small numbers as farm workers with no land of their own when the regime thought it useful. These ideas were not loose dreams, but detailed plans that included budgets, building designs, and clear timetables for putting them into practice. Therefore, the SS chief commissioned studies on soil quality, climate conditions, and agricultural potential. He recruited specialists to design future settlements and set up training programs for people who would one day become colonists, which meant the beliefs were already being turned into concrete plans that could begin as soon as military conquest created the needed space. Alfred Rosenberg, another member of the Inner Circle, served as the chief ideologist and worked to create intellectual support for expansion, and in his book, The Myth of the 20th Century, he wrote at length about what he believed was Germany's historic mission to colonize the East. He argued that Germans had a duty to bring culture to people he viewed as inferior, and his writing offered an academic tone to policies that aimed at deliberate killing and conquest. According to historian Richard Overy, Rosenberg became Reich Minister for the occupied Eastern Territories in 1941, a role that placed him in charge of large areas taken from the Soviet Union. He tried to put the ideological vision into practice, but struggled with everyday administration, which showed how the regime often rewarded strong ideological loyalty, even when a person lacked real skill. The expansion beliefs also created broad agreement inside the Inner Circle, even when its members fought each other fiercely for power, resources, or attention from the leader. Yet despite these rivalries, they agreed on the main goals. Germany must move east, and then the groups they labeled as inferior had to be pushed into a lower position, and the living space had to be taken and held, no matter the cost. However, beliefs included more than racism and expansion. Party beliefs described communism as a mortal enemy that had to be wiped out, and this idea became tangled with hateful beliefs about Jews in a twisted line of reasoning. The party's theory claimed that communism was a Jewish creation meant to weaken and control other peoples, and in this distorted worldview, fighting communism and fighting Jews became the same struggle. The German leader built his early political rise on fierce anti-communist appeals, and the movement began as one of many right-wing groups battling communist organizations in Germany after World War I. Street fights between the movement and communist paramilitaries often took place during the 1920s and early 1930s, and this long record of violence shaped the party's identity, attracting followers who feared a communist takeover. Members of the Inner Circle were chosen partly for their anti-communist reputations, and Goebbels had written at length against communism even before joining the German leader. Himmler formed the SS with the idea that it would be a force trained to combat communism, and Heinrich built his career by tracking and targeting Communist Party members and anyone linked to them. However, the party version of anti-communism went far beyond normal political opposition. Mainstream conservatives disliked communist economic ideas and revolutionary tactics since they opposed collectivization and state control of property and feared that violent uprisings would lead to chaos and mob rule. The party, however, taught that communism was part of a sweeping racial plot that threatened Germany's very existence, and this end-of-the-world framing made any form of compromise or peaceful coexistence impossible. Its beliefs claimed that Jews had created communism to break nations from within and had encouraged class conflict and international unity to weaken what they saw as racial awareness. Communist groups were cast as tools of Jewish control, which meant that fighting communism also required fighting Jewish influence wherever the party believed it appeared. This belief shaped nearly every part of Inner Circle thinking, since they saw danger everywhere because their ideology told them that a Jewish communist plot was always present and endlessly threatening. This fearful worldview allowed them to approve harsher and harsher actions against those they suspected, since anyone who supported communist ideas became a racial traitor in their eyes, and anyone who questioned German nationalism became a possible agent of what they saw as a Jewish plot. The 1939 German-Soviet Pact created a brief moment of cooperation with the communist-led Soviet Union. But their beliefs told the Inner Circle that this agreement was only a short pause. A final clash between the regime and Communist Russia was certain because their ideology demanded it, so the pact served as a temporary convenience rather than any real reconciliation. When Germany launched its attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, the Inner Circle treated the campaign as an ideological fight to wipe out an enemy rather than a normal military conflict. Consequently, the invasion orders explicitly called for destroying the communist system. They demanded the removal of the Soviet elite and told soldiers to see the fighting as a clash between two opposing worldviews, which made the war in the East far more brutal than other fronts. Yet hateful beliefs about Jews stood even closer to the core of party ideology than anti-communism, since these ideas formed the base for nearly everything else the movement taught. Party beliefs placed Jews at the center of a sweeping conspiracy theory meant to explain all the problems of the modern world, and this was not the older religious form of prejudice that could be eased through conversion. Instead, the party pushed a racial idea that treated Jewish identity as permanent and biological, so even a person who converted to Christianity remained Jewish under the movement's racial rules. The beliefs also gave Jews enormous hidden power in their worldview despite their small numbers, claiming that Jews secretly guided international finance, manipulated democratic governments, shaped cultural life, and promoted what the movement called degenerate art and ideas. Every modern trend the regime disliked was blamed on supposed Jewish influence, and democracy, capitalism, communism, modern art, jazz music, and abstract thinking were all described as parts of a single Jewish plot. As a result, this conspiratorial thinking served important psychological functions for the inner circle. It offered simple answers to difficult problems and pointed to clear enemies, turning complex political and economic issues into what the movement claimed was a direct racial struggle. If Germany struggled with its economy, the movement blamed Jewish bankers, and if other nations opposed German expansion, it insisted that Jewish politicians were controlling them, creating an enemy that seemed easy to understand and responsible for every danger. Inner Circle members accepted anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, though each added his own twists, and Goebbels became especially fixated on the idea that Jews controlled the world of news and culture. He believed his propaganda work pushed back against what he saw as Jewish lies with what he called German truth. And his diaries show a steady focus on Jewish influence, along with fierce hatred that grew stronger over the years. Himmler folded anti-Semitism into his broader racial worldview, treating Jews as a biological danger to what he called Aryan purity, and he set up wide-reaching studies of Jewish family backgrounds. He also built large bureaucratic systems to track Jewish communities across Europe, blending ideological hatred with tightly organized record-keeping. The security chief, meanwhile, handled anti-Semitism with his usual focus on efficiency and viewed the harsh treatment of Jews as an administrative task that required orderly, step-by-step solutions. Then he organized the infamous Wannsee Conference in 1942, where party officials coordinated the final solution. His mix of anti-Semitic beliefs and strong bureaucratic skill made him extremely dangerous, since he could plan a brutal act with the same careful focus he used when organizing filing systems. Historical evidence, including diaries and letters examined by Kershaw, shows that the Inner Circle's anti-Semitism was genuine rather than something created only for political gain, and private writings and recorded conversations reveal steady and intense hatred toward Jews. These men were not pretending to hate Jews for advantage. They truly believed the conspiracy stories and saw themselves as fighting what they imagined was a life-or-death racial struggle. This level of ideological commitment allowed them to carry out crimes that otherwise seem impossible to understand, since once they believed Jews were plotting to destroy their race, any act against them felt like self-defense. The beliefs created a false moral framework that turned ordinary prejudice into policies of deliberate killing, making mass killing seem not only acceptable but necessary and even righteous in their eyes. Yet beliefs weren't static but evolved over time. The beliefs did not stay fixed, but grew more extreme throughout the 1930s, and the Inner Circle began competing to suggest harsher policies in order to show their loyalty. This constant pressure pushed the regime toward even more radical steps, since members tried to surpass one another in displays of ideological purity. A historical study by Richard Overy shows that this growing extremism was not mainly the result of the German leader giving direct commands. Instead, the inner circle guessed what he wanted and raced to act on it before others could move first. They understood that bold ideological proposals earned praise and promotion, creating a system that rewarded extreme action while discouraging any restraint. The SS chief and Heydrich became clear examples of this competitive radicalization, and as harsh treatment of Jewish communities increased during the 1930s, each man tried to offer broader measures than his rivals. Heydrich helped organize the 1938 night of widespread attacks that shattered synagogues and Jewish-owned shops across Germany, and this show of ideological loyalty raised his standing within the inner circle. Himmler answered by tightening SS control over the camp system and suggesting more step-by-step methods for targeting Jewish populations, which showed how both men mixed sincere belief with rivalry. They also competed for power and influence, and together these forces drove policy toward growing levels of brutality. As a result, this competitive dynamic meant the regime lacked meaningful brakes on radicalization. In normal political systems, different factions hold each other in check, since cautious voices usually slow the pace while radicals push for action, and the final policy comes from negotiation between these sides. The regime removed this balance entirely because anyone who suggested moderation or simple human concern instantly looked weak or untrustworthy. Its beliefs treated compromise as betrayal and saw restraint as fear, and inner circle members quickly learned to avoid any remark that might sound gentle or not fully committed. This produced an atmosphere where only the harshest proposals received attention, and Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda chief, showed clearly how this competition worked. All through the 1930s, Goebbels kept widening the reach of anti-Jewish propaganda, making it more forceful and more widespread, and each new campaign pushed further than the one before it. Every new step in propaganda was crafted to prove Goebbels's loyalty to the ideology and to display his own skill, and records studied by Kershaw show that he constantly feared rivals who might weaken his standing. He understood that others in the inner circle were watching for any sign of doubt or lack of commitment, and this fear drove him to make stronger public statements and policy suggestions that no one could challenge as too mild or too cautious. And in 1939, after the war, the competitive radicalization had accelerated. The wartime emergency gave leaders a reason to approve measures that might have seemed far too extreme in peacetime, and inner circle members saw this opening and rushed to push long-planned ideological programs into action. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, racial policy was put into practice on a huge scale almost at once, and within weeks, SS units were carrying out killings of Polish intellectuals, priests, and community leaders. These brutal acts were not directed step by step from Berlin. They grew from local SS commanders competing to prove their ideological loyalty by striking quickly at people they labeled racial enemies. Himmler praised these actions and allowed commanders wide freedom to continue, sending a strong message through the SS that extreme action earned approval while any sign of delay raised suspicion. What shocked observers one year became accepted the next, and measures that once seemed unthinkable slowly turned into routine policy through this ongoing escalation. Nevertheless, beliefs alone didn't make the mass atrocity inevitable. The belief system gave leaders both a reason to act and a sense of direction, yet turning these ideas into step-by-step programs of systematic deaths required organization, resources, and choices made at key moments. The inner circle's ideological commitment made them willing to support deadly programs, but carrying them out demanded a large bureaucratic structure and steady, ongoing effort. This is where the mix of strong belief and practical skill became especially dangerous, since the SS chief truly accepted racial ideas while also having the organizational ability to build institutions that worked efficiently. The security chief joined deep anti-Semitic convictions with a talent for creating orderly, systematic methods, and the propaganda chief needed both ideological loyalty and technical understanding of modern media to shape public opinion. Therefore, the historical research emphasizes that knowing party crimes requires recognizing how beliefs and organization reinforced each other. The beliefs gave direction and justification, while administrative skill supplied the means, and the inner circle was filled with men who held these two qualities in different amounts. Yet one question remains central. How did intelligent, educated men convince themselves that such grotesque beliefs were true rather than dangerous fantasy? How did capable administrators accept ideas that any clear-headed analysis would dismiss as hateful nonsense? The answer comes from several forces working together. First, the beliefs offered meaning and purpose during years of upheaval, since Germany had faced defeat in the First World War, along with economic collapse and political disorder. The party's worldview explained these disasters and promised a path back to strength and pride, which was mentally appealing even when it ignored actual evidence. Second, the beliefs supported personal ambition, since inner circle members gained great power and comfort by embracing them. The system rewarded loyalty to the ideology with promotion, authority, and material benefits, giving strong incentives to believe the ideas were correct. Third, the beliefs were wrapped in scientific-sounding language, as party writers produced long pseudo-academic works filled with charts, measurements, and formal terms. This gave racial ideas a thin layer of intellectual respectability, allowing educated men to tell themselves they were following science instead of prejudice. And fourth, the beliefs were strengthened through constant repetition and group pressure, since party members sat through countless meetings where these ideas were treated as an obvious truth. Anyone who raised doubts faced isolation or worse, and this echo chamber made extreme beliefs feel normal and even sensible to those inside it. But perhaps most importantly, the beliefs allowed these men to see themselves as heroes rather than villains. They told themselves they were not committing crimes, but defending their race, and they insisted they were not harming innocent people, but fighting what they believed was a threat to civilization. The beliefs turned killing into a mission and cruelty into something they claimed was necessary, and this mental shift became central to how the inner circle operated. Without this mindset, these men would have been ordinary criminals driven by greed or hatred, but with it, they viewed themselves as ideological fighters convinced their cause was righteous. The inner circle's beliefs were not decoration for ambition, but the driving force behind their choices, and understanding those beliefs is necessary to understand their actions. Because these beliefs turned rivalry into oppression and competition into systematic deaths, the ideology gave them both permission and purpose, allowing the leader's closest followers to build the machinery behind these deadly acts. Yet beliefs alone only created the possibility for such harm, since turning that possibility into reality required power, organization, and steady, ruthless action. And this is where the inner circle's expanding empires come into view and where the death toll begins rising into the millions. Section 3. The Empires. By the late 1930s, Hitler's inner circle had built large structures that became personal empires, far more powerful than normal offices, and each exercised wide and frightening authority. This system revealed the regime's true shape because the German leader rejected a normal hierarchy and ruled through rival power centers, keeping his subordinates competing with one another instead of challenging him. This design pushed the inner circle to fight for influence, rewarded bold action, and punished hesitation, which drove party policies toward increasingly extreme results. Heinrich Himmler, the SS chief, oversaw the most alarming empire, and what began in 1929 as a guard of 280 men grew into a state within a state answering only to Himmler and the dictator. Historical studies show that the SS first served mainly as a rally guard inside the larger SA, yet Himmler quickly separated it by raising membership demands, requiring proof of ancestry, tightening physical standards and training, and adopting uniforms that made SS members instantly recognizable. By 1933, when the German leader became chancellor, the SS had about 52,000 members, and although still smaller than the SA, it was far more disciplined, more loyal, and more committed to the belief system. Then came the Night of the Long Knives in 1934. The SS chief used his growing organization to carry out the purge of Rohm and the SA leadership, and this action showed complete loyalty to Hitler while also removing the SS's biggest rival inside the party. After the purge, the Führer rewarded Himmler by separating the SS from the SA, and now the SS reported directly to the German leader, giving Himmler the freedom to expand his empire without other groups blocking his way. Within only a few months, the SS chief had taken control of every police force in Germany, a level of power unheard of in normal countries, where police report to civilian leaders under legal oversight. Yet under the regime, all police answered to Himmler alone. He combined the many state and local police departments into one national force and then placed that entire system under SS authority, with the regular police, or ORPO, handling everyday order while the security police, or SIPO, focused on political crimes and surveillance. Most ominously, Himmler held full command over the Gestapo, the secret police that could arrest anyone suspected of opposing the regime, keep prisoners for as long as they chose without trial, and use torture during questioning while answering to no court at all. According to historian Richard Overy, the Gestapo employed roughly 32,000 people by 1939, including office staff and informants, and although this number seems small for a nation of 80 million, the Gestapo did not need large forces to maintain control. Consequently, they relied on fear and on ordinary Germans reporting their neighbors. The system relied on psychological terror, since anyone could be arrested on the basis of anonymous accusations, and because no one knew who might report on them, people began monitoring their own behavior and speech. The SS chief also oversaw the concentration camp network that began in 1933, when the first camps held political prisoners, communists, and socialists the regime wanted removed from public life, and although these early camps were harsh, they remained limited in size. Under Himmler's direction, however, the camp system grew step by step as new sites opened across Germany, and the prisoner numbers rose from a few thousand in 1933 to tens of thousands by 1939, with the camps now holding not only political opponents but anyone the regime labeled undesirable. According to Longerich, documents from camp administrators show that the SS chief organized the system with his usual bureaucratic precision, creating a unified chain of command, setting standard procedures for handling prisoners, and building work programs that later turned into large-scale forced labor operations. In Himmler's broader vision, the camps served many roles at once, since they removed those seen as enemies, frightened the population into compliance, supplied labor for SS-controlled businesses, and acted as testing grounds for putting racial beliefs into practice. So in 1939, the SS empire included far more than police and camps. The SS chief built an economic branch known as the SS Main Economic and Administrative Office, and this division managed a wide range of SS-run businesses, including construction firms, factories, and farm operations. These enterprises relied on concentration camp prisoners who were forced to work without pay in brutal conditions, and while the SS profited from this labor, they claimed they were re-educating or punishing enemies of the Reich. According to Longerich, The SS also created its own fighting units known as the Waffen-SS, which served as combat forces separate from the regular armed forces, fought beside Wehrmacht troops, yet kept their own command system and answered directly to Himmler. The Waffen-SS began with only a small group of a few thousand men in the mid-1930s, but by 1945 it grew into nearly 1 million soldiers organized into dozens of divisions, forming a parallel military machine loyal to the SS rather than to Germany's traditional defense leadership. Himmler also directed intelligence and security work across occupied territories, and as the Third Reich seized new regions, SS teams followed the army to impose party rule, identify and detain resistance figures, enforce racial doctrine, and create local police forces under SS control. This empire expanded through a predictable pattern, since the SS chief would find a function that needed to be carried out, build an SS office to manage it, prove greater efficiency or stronger ideological devotion, and then receive official authority from the Führer over that area of responsibility. As a result, each expansion gave Himmler greater power and additional resources for the next one. Numbers reveal how vast this empire became, since the SS expanded from 280 men in 1929 to 52,000 by 1933, then to roughly 240,000 by 1939, and finally to more than 1 million by 1945, a rise of more than 3,500 times in only 16 years. The concentration camp network, which began with only a few thousand prisoners in 1933, would later hold millions, and the Gestapo, which started with only a small group of officers, eventually relied on informants found in nearly every neighborhood and workplace across the nation. According to Kershaw, the SS chief's empire operated through several connected branches, with the SS forming the core, the police forces supplying enforcement, the camps removing enemies and providing labor, the economic operations producing revenue, the Waffen-SS supplying military force, and the security services gathering intelligence. Each part strengthened the others, since the police could send people to the camps supplied workers for SS-run businesses, the businesses financed further SS growth, and the security units identified new targets for the police to arrest. This self-feeding system expanded steadily throughout the Third Reich period, taking in more resources, employing more people, controlling larger territories, and carrying out policies that grew more extreme over time. But Himmler wasn't the only one building an empire. Joseph Goebbels controlled something even more powerful than the police or the armed forces, since he shaped what Germans saw, heard, read, and believed. And his propaganda empire directed public opinion while building support for the regime. When the Führer made him Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, he granted Goebbels broad authority over media, culture, and public communication across the nation. According to Kershaw, Goebbels moved quickly to expand control, and within months he created the Reich Chamber of Culture, a network that divided German cultural life into 7 groups overseeing press, radio, theater, music, literature, film, and visual arts. Every journalist, actor, musician, writer, filmmaker, and artist had to join the proper chamber, and since membership required ministry approval, anyone labeled politically unreliable or racially unacceptable could be blocked from working. This system gave Goebbels near total authority because, without chamber membership, a person could not legally work, and thousands lost their careers when his ministry denied them entry. Longerich notes that by 1939, the ministry had about 2,000 staff members, yet its reach extended much farther through a wide cultural network filled with specialists trained in communication and persuasion. Additionally, the ministry had departments for each media type and target audience. One branch of the ministry managed newspapers and magazines, another oversaw radio, and film had its own division, while other departments targeted youth, women, foreign audiences, and rural communities, each shaping propaganda for its specific group. The propaganda chief knew that shaping content was not enough, so he also controlled access and distribution, meaning his ministry decided who could own newspapers, who received radio licenses, and which films appeared in theaters. Longerich notes that documents from the era show Goebbels personally reviewed major material by reading newspaper proofs, listening to radio programs, and watching films before release, ensuring nothing reached the public without his approval. Radio became especially important, since Goebbels understood it could send the same message to millions at once, and he pushed factories to produce simple receivers known as the people's receiver, which workers could buy with about 2 weeks' wages, and by the late 1930s, more than half of German households owned one. Welch adds that Goebbels made sure German radios tuned only to local stations, making foreign broadcasts hard to hear and keeping the public from receiving outside viewpoints or conflicting information. Consequently, the ministry organized programming carefully to maximize impact. The leaders' major speeches were broadcast live with elaborate ceremonies, and special programs presented party beliefs as entertainment or education, while news broadcasts followed scripts prepared by Goebbels' staff, offering only government-approved versions of events. The film industry operated under a similar level of control, since the propaganda chief placed major film companies under government supervision and required every production to gain approval from his ministry both before filming and again before distribution. Some films promoted party beliefs openly by praising doctrine or attacking enemies, while others appeared to be simple entertainment, yet carried quiet messages that supported the goals of the regime. And Goebbels understood that audiences often accepted ideas more easily through entertainment than from obvious propaganda. The newspaper system was reshaped through a process the Nazis called Gleichschaltung, which meant coordination, and papers that opposed the movement were closed, while those that remained came under indirect state influence through daily press directives. These directives, sent each day from Goebbels' ministry, told editors what topics to cover and how to present them, and they explained which issues to highlight, which to reduce, and which to avoid completely, sometimes even giving editors exact phrases to use. And according to historian Oron J. Hale, preserved directives show remarkable detail, since the propaganda chief did more than set broad rules and often controlled the reporting of specific events by telling editors how much space to give to stories and which photographs to include. As a result, this system created uniform national messaging. Someone could read newspapers in Munich, Hamburg, and Berlin and find almost identical reports of major events, since different papers used different words but still told the same story from the same point of view, and the appearance of diverse media hid the reality of complete central control. Goebbels also directed public events and ceremonies, turning party rallies, demonstrations, and celebrations into carefully staged performances, and his ministry managed every detail from decorations and lighting to music and the exact timing of speeches. The famous Nuremberg rallies showed this method most clearly, because these huge gatherings brought hundreds of thousands of people together for days of speeches, ceremonies, and military displays, and every element was arranged in advance for maximum emotional effect. In his book Inside the Third Reich, architect Albert Speer described working closely with Goebbels on the design of these rallies, with Speer creating dramatic features such as the Cathedral of Light, where searchlights pointed toward the sky to form tall columns, while the propaganda chief scripted the program so that tension rose steadily toward the leader's final speech. The propaganda empire also reached into nearly every part of daily life. Since schools used textbooks approved by the Goebbels ministry, theaters showed only approved plays, bookstores sold only approved literature, museums displayed only approved art, and loudspeakers in streets and workplaces broadcast approved programs. Overall, numbers reveal the empire's comprehensive reach. According to propaganda historian David Welch, by 1939, the propaganda ministry controlled all 4,700 newspapers and magazines published in Germany, supervised every radio station that reached German listeners, regulated all 3,000 film theaters across the country, and oversaw about 2,000 stages that presented live performances. The ministry budget grew from almost nothing in 1933 to hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks each year by the late 1930s, and this money paid not only for staff wages but also for huge propaganda campaigns that used every form of media the regime could reach. Goebbels' empire worked through both rewards and punishment, since artists who cooperated received funding, publicity, and important commissions, while those who resisted lost the chance to work, faced social exclusion, or were sent to concentration camps. The system did not require the propaganda chief to read or watch everything himself because his aides learned what he wanted and carried out his wishes inside their own departments, and over time, the bureaucracy became self-regulating as everyone understood what would happen if they strayed from the expected line. Meanwhile, a different kind of empire was taking shape. Hermann Göring, the Air Force chief, built an empire rooted in military strength and economic exploitation, and as commander of the Luftwaffe and overseer of economic planning, he controlled both the nation's air force and large parts of its industrial capacity. The leader appointed Goering to command the Luftwaffe when it was first presented to the public in 1935, and this decision made sense because he had served as a World War I fighter pilot, which gave him real combat experience and strong military knowledge. According to Overy, Goering moved quickly to expand the Air Force with enormous ambition, and he began this work at a moment when the Treaty of Versailles had fully banned Germany from keeping military aircraft, which meant the Luftwaffe had to grow from almost nothing in the mid-1930s. By 1939, it had grown into one of the most powerful air forces in the world, and this transformation happened with remarkable speed as Goering created aircraft factories, training centers, and air bases across the country, while also recruiting pilots, mechanics, and support workers who filled out the growing service. He then organized squadrons and developed tactical plans that shaped how these forces would operate once the fighting began. Numbers help show how dramatic this rise was, since in 1935 the nation had only a few hundred military aircraft, most of them trainers or converted civilian planes, yet by 1939 the Luftwaffe possessed roughly 4,000 operational aircraft that included modern fighters, bombers, and support planes. Furthermore, the force included highly trained aircrew with extensive practice. German pilots gained valuable combat experience during the Spanish Civil War when the Luftwaffe sent units to support Franco's forces, and this early fighting allowed the Air Force to test tactics and uncover equipment problems before the nation's own conflict began. The Air Force chief's military empire gave him enormous prestige and influence, and the Luftwaffe became a visible symbol of the Reich's strength and rapid rearmament. Its public displays at rallies and air shows impressed people across the nation and also caught the attention of foreign observers, since air power represented modern technology and modern authority. However, Goering's reach extended far beyond commanding the Air Force, because in 1936 the Führer appointed him head of the four-year plan, and this role gave him broad authority over economic planning and industrial production. This appointment created overlapping responsibility with other state ministries that officially managed economic policy. Yet in practice, the Air Force Chief's Year Plan Office could overrule other agencies and decide which industries received resources, which projects moved forward, and how the economy should be shaped. According to historian Adam Tooze, Goering used this authority to build a massive economic empire, and the four-year plan created large state-owned industrial operations, including the Hermann Göring Works, which became one of the biggest industrial groups in Europe. Additionally, this company controlled coal mines, iron ore production, steel mills, and armaments factories. It employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and it produced materials that were essential for military rearmament. And it also made the Air Force chief personally wealthy through schemes that diverted profits and resources for his own benefit. According to Overy, Göring gained vast personal wealth during the party period, and he built several elaborate estates, including Hall, a large hunting lodge filled with stolen art and luxury goods. His collections contained paintings taken from Jewish owners and from countries that had fallen under German control. The economic empire worked partly as a real industrial system and partly as a tool for systematic plunder. And whenever the Nazi regime conquered new territory, the Air Force Chief's economic network followed the fighting forces to seize valuable assets. His agents identified factories, raw materials, art collections, and financial holdings in occupied regions, and they moved these assets under German control, often sending them into enterprises that Göring controlled either directly or through the four-year Plan Office. In occupied Poland, France, and other nations, Göring's economic empire stripped these regions of their wealth. As factories were taken apart and moved to the Reich, raw materials were shipped to German industries, and art and valuables were stolen and distributed among party leaders, with the Air Force chief keeping the finest pieces for himself. But the numbers reveal the scale of this plunder. Historical estimates noted by Overy suggest Göring personally gained an art collection worth tens of millions of Reichsmarks, mostly through theft, and the Hermann Göring works grew to employ more than 600,000 workers by 1941, while the four-year Plan Office controlled parts of the German economy valued at billions of Reichsmarks. The Air Force Chief's empire also extended into the Reich Forest Office, which supervised the nation's forests and hunting preserves. And although this appeared to be a minor position, it gave Göring authority over large areas of land and natural resources, while also feeding his strong love of hunting. By contrast with the SS chief's ideological fanaticism or the propaganda chief's focus on shaping public opinion, Göring's empire reflected his hedonistic personality, and he enjoyed luxury, display, and personal comfort while building a system that served the Führer's goals for military strength and economic control. Adding to this, the Luftwaffe took part in every major German military campaign, and the four-year Plan Office mobilized the nation's industry for war production, while the economic exploitation of conquered regions supplied resources that supported German fighting forces. And together, these elements meant the Air Force Chief's empire contributed greatly to the party's military success in the early years of the conflict. However, both military and economic empires had serious weaknesses. The Luftwaffe was created for short and aggressive campaigns that supported ground forces, and it lacked long-range heavy bombers needed for planned warfare, while also being unable to recover from heavy losses during long conflicts. So when the fighting turned against the Reich, its weaknesses became serious problems. The economic empire depended on plunder and forced labor instead of efficient industrial organization, and it produced overlapping authorities and competing agencies, while Göring's personal corruption pushed resources away from military needs and toward private luxury, and these flaws grew more visible as the conflict continued. Even so, in the late 1930s and the early war years, the Air Force Chief's empire appeared successful, since the Luftwaffe dominated the skies across Europe, and the economic system seemed to operate smoothly, and Göring himself stood second only to the Führer in rank and public importance. His empire gave him authority that rivaled Himmler's in a different sphere, since the SS chief controlled security and fear while Göring controlled military force and industrial production. And where Himmler built his empire on ideological devotion, the Air Force chief built his on military prestige and economic direction, as both men fought for resources, influence, and the leader's approval. This rivalry was exactly what Hitler wanted, because as long as Himmler and Göring competed with each other, neither could rise high enough to challenge him, and their struggle kept them focused on blocking one another rather than forming any united opposition. Meanwhile, a fourth empire was growing quietly in the shadows, built on something seemingly mundane, but ultimately essential to party control. Martin Bormann, the party manager, built his empire differently from the SS chief, the propaganda chief, or Göring, and although he commanded no police, armies, media, or economic planning, he gained influence over something quieter but equally powerful, since he controlled paperwork, procedures and access to the leader. He joined early, worked upward through the party bureaucracy, stayed out of the spotlight, and handled administrative tasks behind the scenes. Yet this modest image hid determined ambition, and while Hess held the title of deputy, he was disorganized and distracted by unusual ideas, leaving Bormann to run the administrative machinery in practice. When Hess flew to Scotland on his unauthorized mission in May 1941, the leader removed him and placed Bormann in charge of the party chancellery, which only formalized what was already true. Since Bormann had managed the system long before the title became official, this position gave him wide authority, and although the party and government were technically separate, they merged completely in daily practice, since many officials held roles in both areas, and decisions in one sphere shaped the other, allowing Bormann to control finances, supervise regional leaders, manage personnel, and direct all communication reaching the Führer. Kershaw notes that Bormann handled large volumes of paperwork each day as he organized the documents that kept the system operating, and this was not empty bureaucracy, but the machinery of control, because these papers included proposals, appointments, budget requests, and reports from every level of the hierarchy. Ultimately, Bormann decided which documents Hitler saw and in what order. He summarized long reports into short notes, and he added recommendations on which proposals should move forward. He also arranged meetings while deciding who would receive time with the leader, and this gatekeeping role gave Bormann enormous influence. As a result, anyone who wanted to present an idea to the Führer increasingly had to go through the party manager first, and anyone who hoped for a meeting found that Bormann controlled the schedule, and even letters sent to the leader passed through Bormann's hands as he decided whether they reached Hitler at all. This rise did not come from a sudden seizure of authority, because it developed slowly as the party manager made himself more useful each day, and he accepted administrative tasks that others avoided, stayed near the leader's headquarters while others traveled, and remained available whenever the Führer needed something handled. Kershaw notes that Hitler valued Bormann's efficiency and caution, since the dictator disliked paperwork and routine administrative matters, and Bormann managed these responsibilities with steady competence while avoiding unnecessary interruptions, which made the leader depend on his services. By the early 1940s, Bormann had become one of the most powerful men in the regime, even though he held no traditional position of might, and while he commanded no troops or police forces and controlled neither media nor industry, he controlled the process and the access that shaped how the entire system functioned. Therefore, the administrative empire functioned through the party manager's complete mastery of the party bureaucracy. He understood every regulation and procedure and knew the duties of each party official, which let him speed up actions he supported, slow those he disliked, and reward or punish people through simple administrative choices. The reach of his authority was enormous, since the party chancellery employed thousands who handled the constant flow of documents, and regional offices reported directly to him, while hundreds of officials held positions because of his backing. Although less visible than the SS chief's security network or the Air Force chief's military machine, his empire remained essential because ideology shaped the regime's goals, while administration kept it operating each day. He also controlled large financial resources from party dues, business donations, and party enterprises, allowing him to support programs he favored and weaken those he opposed, which strengthened his influence through financial control. Kershaw notes that Bormann used this position to wage steady bureaucratic battles, and when the SS chief or Göring sought access to the Führer, Bormann could delay or assist them, frame their proposals positively or negatively, and either support or obstruct their need for party cooperation. He clashed frequently with Göring, whom he viewed as corrupt and self-indulgent, and as the Führer grew more isolated, Bormann's gatekeeping role became even more important, and by 1945, He was among the last in the final bunker, staying at his post because his power depended entirely on the survival of the party system. Ultimately, the administrative empire's importance is often underestimated. It lacked the dramatic visibility of police terror or military conquest, yet it formed the essential infrastructure that made everything else possible. Since terror needed bureaucratic systems to process prisoners, the armed forces needed administration to move supplies, and propaganda needed organized distribution to reach its audiences. Bormann's empire supplied this structure and acted as the connective tissue of the party state, because it turned the leader's vague wishes into direct orders, coordinated rival agencies, and kept records that documented the regime's crimes, making it one of the most crucial yet least visible empires. One final empire completed the inner circle's control, and it became especially deadly because it combined industrial efficiency with total disregard for human life. Albert Speer entered the inner circle through the leader's passion for monumental buildings, and as a young architect, he impressed the Führer by completing designs quickly and skillfully. Longerich notes that Speer's staging for the 1934 Nuremberg rally, with searchlights forming tall columns of light, deeply impressed the dictator, and this cathedral of light became one of the most famous images of party spectacle. The leader gradually gave Speer larger projects, including the vast plan to rebuild Berlin as Germania, a world capital filled with enormous structures such as the Great Hall, which would have been the largest enclosed space on Earth, and these projects brought Speer into regular personal contact with the Führer. Their long discussions about architecture helped create a personal bond, unusual in such a rigid hierarchy, and this closeness lifted Speer's status within the inner circle. Then suddenly, the war changed everything. As the nation fought increasingly desperate campaigns, architectural projects slowly lost importance, and weapons production became the urgent priority. And when Armaments Minister Fritz Todt died in a plane crash in early 1942, the leader appointed Speer to take his place despite the architect's lack of industrial management experience. This choice proved remarkably effective for the movement's war efforts, since the new arms minister showed strong organizational ability by turning skills from architectural project management into methods for directing industrial production. As a result, he reorganized the Reich's armaments industry with surprising speed for greater efficiency. Overy notes that documents from the period show Speer's approach depended on rational planning and tighter central direction, and he reduced the number of different weapon models so factories could mass-produce standard designs, while also coordinating production across many sites, streamlining decisions, and removing administrative barriers. The results were significant, since armaments production grew sharply under the arms minister's direction, even though the nation faced Allied bombing and shortages of resources. Some historians note that the scale of these increases has been debated and may have been overstated because Speer later shaped parts of his own story. Yet tank production still rose between 1942 and 1944. Aircraft output more than doubled, and ammunition production increased even more. These gains came at a time when the country was losing the conflict and suffering heavy air attacks, and the arms minister's organizational ability kept German forces supplied with weapons and ammunition far longer than many observers believed possible, and this extended the Reich's ability to continue fighting. Overall, the production empire Speer built was enormous in scale. By 1944, millions worked in industries shaped by Speer's authority, and while more than 12 million people were forced into labor across the Reich, the arms minister was one of its major users, drawing on German factory workers, civilians taken from occupied regions, and prisoners from camps, and the entire system depended on forced labor. Longerich shows that Speer directly expanded these programs by working with the SS chief to place concentration camp prisoners in factories, and by negotiating with Fritz Sauckel, who ran forced labor efforts. to secure more workers from occupied territories. The Arms Ministry also oversaw huge construction projects built by prisoners, including underground factories meant to shield production from Allied bombing, and tens of thousands died in these sites because of brutal conditions, starvation, and mistreatment. The production empire relied on strict organization, and Speer created a system of committees and rings that managed different weapons and supplies, which allowed rapid problem-solving, quick shifts of workers and materials, and fast relocation when bombing destroyed factories, keeping production moving with surprising speed. Ultimately, numbers reveal the production empire's massive output. Overy notes that German war production in 1944 exceeded production in 1941, even after years of bombing and lost territory, and the nation produced about 40,000 aircraft in 1944 compared to about 11,000 in 1941, while tank output rose from around 5,000 in 1941 to more than 19,000 in 1944. This increase kept German fighting forces supplied far longer than Allied leaders expected, and it prolonged the conflict and led to millions more deaths. And in this way, Speer's organizational ability directly extended the regime's capacity to continue the war. The empire relied mainly on forced labor, since roughly 7 million foreign workers served in Germany by 1944, and about 2 million were prisoners of war, while an estimated 5 million were civilians taken from occupied regions, and hundreds of thousands of camp prisoners also worked in war production. These workers received very little food, poor shelter, and harsh treatment, and those who grew too weak to work were often sent back to camps where many died or were killed through violence, and the system consumed human lives to keep weapons flowing. Overy explains that the arms minister visited factories that used forced labor, and he saw the conditions and received reports on death rates and output, and he understood that the system rested on systematic mistreatment and the killing of workers, yet he continued expanding it because it produced results. After the war, Speer presented himself as an apolitical technocrat. He claimed he focused only on technical problems and stayed away from the belief system, and he described his work as simple industrial management without moral meaning. And this convenient story helped him avoid punishment at Nuremberg. Overy shows that this excuse has been completely disproven, and Speer was closely involved in the most criminal parts of party production, including forced labor programs and the deliberate working to death of camp prisoners, and his technical skill made him more dangerous instead of less guilty. The production empire demonstrated how efficient systems could support deliberate killing, and the arms minister used modern management methods to keep the regime's war machine running. His organizational talent prolonged the conflict and increased the number of deaths. Together, these 5 empires formed the true structure of party authority. Since the SS chief controlled security and fear, Goebbels shaped information and culture, Goering directed air power and economic exploitation, Bormann managed administration and access to the leader, and Speer controlled industrial output and forced labor. Each empire was huge in size, each employed hundreds of thousands or even millions of people, each consumed large amounts of resources, and each fought with the others for influence, resources, and the leader's approval. In essence, this competitive structure was no accident. Hitler, on purpose, created overlapping authorities and competing agencies, and he gave different men similar or conflicting responsibilities while refusing to define where one empire ended and another began. And this uncertainty forced constant competition inside the regime. As a result, the rivalry served several purposes, since it stopped any single subordinate from gaining enough independent authority to threaten the dictator, kept the inner circle focused on fighting one another instead of working together, and rewarded extreme action as each man tried to prove a stronger commitment and greater effectiveness. Most importantly, the competition caused steady radicalization, because when the SS chief arrested thousands, Goering felt pressure to match that level of zeal, and when the propaganda chief launched a new campaign, others felt driven to show loyalty through even harsher measures, and when Speer raised production by 10%, he felt compelled to raise it even more the next time to protect his status. This competitive pattern pushed party policies toward more extreme forms of implementation, and the inner circle tried to show who could most effectively carry out the leader's vague wishes, and they guessed what he wanted and raced to deliver it first, which created rising brutality as the cost of staying in his favor. Adding to this, the empires also supported one another in deadly ways because the SS chief's camp system supplied workers for the arms minister's factories, and Goebbels shaped public opinion to prepare people for the policies the SS chief carried out, while the Air Force chief's economic network provided resources for the others, and the party manager's administration linked the competing empires together. Overall, the system was designed for radicalization, not restraint. Each member of the inner circle understood that success depended on expanding his empire through increasingly extreme action, and moderation appeared as weakness, while any form of human concern seemed like disloyalty, and the only path to survival and advancement came from proving absolute commitment through clear results. This created a downward spiral of competitive radicalization, and the empires grew larger as the policies became more extreme, and the number of deaths continued to rise while the inner circle competed to show who could best serve the leader's vision of deliberate killing. By the late 1930s, these empires were fully formed and working at high efficiency, and the machinery of control was already in place, and the rivalry had become part of the system, and the entire structure was prepared for large-scale crime, and it needed only the right moment and direction. The outbreak of war in 1939 supplied both, and the empires that had been built in the years of peace were now released in conquest. And the same competition that had driven radical change at home now pushed even harsher policies in the occupied regions, and the inner circle's empires were about to show their true and deadly potential. But the greatest danger came from how these unrestrained empires operated, because once they focused on racial policy, their internal competition pushed the movement toward industrial-scale abuse and widespread deaths. Section 4. The Atrocities. The empires were built, the competition was in place, and the machinery stood ready, and what followed was the systematic implementation of the belief system on a scale without precedent in human history. This is how the mass crime happened, because the leaders supplied the vision while the inner circle provided the methods, and their rivalry pushed them to carry out that vision as effectively and aggressively as possible. These were not reluctant men following unwanted orders, since they competed to prove loyalty through extreme action, each using the power of his empire to outdo the others. The crimes did not suddenly appear in 1939 or 1941, because they grew step by step through competitive radicalization, and each measure prepared the ground for harsher actions, while every success encouraged even more ambitious proposals. Kershaw notes that harsh treatment of Jews increased steadily from 1933 onward, beginning with economic boycotts and professional exclusions, and these early actions appeared as discrimination rather than open violence. The Nuremberg laws in September 1935 then stripped Jews of citizenship and banned marriage between Jews and non-Jews, creating a legal structure that defined Jews as a separate and inferior group. These laws did not come from a detailed order by the leader, since they emerged from competition among officials trying to prove commitment to racial beliefs, and the drafters rushed to finish before the annual rally, competing to make the measures broader and more extreme. The SS enforced them by investigating ancestry and tracking Jewish communities, while Goebbels used propaganda to portray Jews as dangerous enemies, making each new restriction seem reasonable through constant repetition. By 1938, the escalation had accelerated dramatically. The propaganda chief orchestrated Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10th in 1938, and this large pogrom destroyed synagogues and Jewish businesses across Germany and Austria, and Longerich notes that more than 1,000 synagogues were burned or destroyed, while about 7,500 Jewish businesses had their windows smashed and their contents stolen. Overy explains that about 91 Jews were killed during the night, and more than 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to camps, and this became the largest act of anti-Jewish mistreatment carried out under party rule up to that point. Goebbels organized Kristallnacht not on direct orders but to outmaneuver rivals like Himmler and Göring, using the violence to prove his superior zeal for racial policy. The pogrom succeeded in proving Goebbels' zeal, and it also showed how far the regime had moved toward open mistreatment of Jews, since what had begun as economic and legal pressure now turned into physical destruction and large-scale arrests. Most importantly, Kristallnacht revealed that the German public would tolerate such abuse, and the police did nothing to stop the destruction while fire departments protected nearby buildings but allowed synagogues to burn, and many ordinary Germans either took part, watched silently, or simply looked away, and open resistance was scarce. This lack of public opposition encouraged the inner circle, and when such clear brutality brought no meaningful pushback, they felt driven by the competitive dynamic to see what might be possible next. Afterward, the invasion of Poland in September 1939 created new opportunities for radicalization. Poland held Europe's largest Jewish population of about 3 million people, and it also contained Slavic communities whose belief system was labeled as inferior, and it offered territory outside the Reich where actions could unfold with little outside attention. The SS chief moved in behind the German forces while special units called Einsatzgruppen were created to secure the region, and although they claimed they were removing resistance and restoring control, their real mission went far beyond ordinary security work. Longerich shows that these units quickly began organized killing of Polish leaders by targeting intellectuals, priests, teachers, and community figures, and the plan aimed to break Polish society by removing those who could lead resistance. And these were not random deaths, but planned operations built on lists created from research into local communities. Overy explains that the Einsatzgruppen killed about 50,000 to 60,000 Polish civilians in the first months of occupation, and this happened before the industrial phase of the mass crimes. It proved the SS already had both the ability and the will to carry out organized, deadly actions. Himmler praised these operations and rewarded the commanders, and this clear approval told the SS that extreme action earned advancement, while hesitation raised suspicion, and the competition for success therefore pushed officers toward even greater brutality. Meanwhile, Goering contributed through economic plunder. His agencies seized Jewish property in Poland by taking businesses, homes, and valuables, and this was done through steady expropriation that looked official, since Jews first had to register their property before it was taken through simple administrative orders. Kershaw notes that the Air Force chief ordered Jews in occupied Poland to wear identifying armbands, and this made them easy to target for later harsh treatment, while appearing at first like an ordinary administrative rule. Goering also led the Reich Defense Council meeting in November 1939, where officials argued over how to handle the so-called Jewish question in the occupied regions, and the meeting notes show rival agencies each trying to control this policy to prove their value. Because of this rivalry, escalation had already begun, and actions that started as discrimination in Germany had turned into organized, deadly operations in Poland, while the conflict was still young. And as the Reich gained more land, the inner circle's competition pushed policies toward even harsher levels. Between 1939 and 1941, the inner circle tested different methods of Jewish policy by setting up ghettos in Polish cities that locked Jewish residents into sealed districts, and these ghettos became testing grounds for ways to control and exploit populations the regime intended to remove later. Ultimately, the ghetto system showed the competitive dynamic clearly. Different cities created different ghetto administrations under separate officials, and each one tried to prove its ghetto was the best organized by showing tight control of Jewish labor while spending as little as possible on keeping people alive. As a result, conditions grew steadily worse. Since food supplies dropped, overcrowding increased, disease spread, and death rates rose as officials pushed the limits to display efficiency. And this was not accidental neglect but deliberate policy shaped by competition inside the regime. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, ran his territory like a personal empire built on exploiting Polish resources for German benefit. And Longerich notes that he enforced racial policies with enthusiasm while competing with the SS chief for influence over Jewish harsh treatment. Frank's administration organized forced labor, property seizure, and harsh restrictions, and he often made speeches boasting about his strict efficiency in carrying out the belief system. His goal was to impress the Führer while surpassing other inner circle members. By early 1941, occupied Poland revealed clear patterns because the inner circle competed to prove commitment through extreme measures, and each success encouraged even bolder proposals, while victims faced rising suffering, and the German public either accepted or ignored the growing crimes. Then Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The invasion of the Soviet Union created conditions for the most deadly phase of the mass crimes, since the vast territory, large civilian population, and racial framing of the conflict removed the last restraints. The Führer described the invasion as a fight for survival between opposing worldviews rather than a normal military conflict, and this framing treated it as a struggle against racial and political enemies and allowed unlimited violence. The SS chief was prepared, and Einsatzgruppen followed the German forces with orders to eliminate Jews, communists, and other targets. And these actions were no longer small operations like in Poland, but organized, deadly campaigns on a new scale. Overy notes that 4 main Einsatzgruppen were sent in behind the advancing army, each with several thousand men, and their assignment was to eliminate Jewish communities in occupied Soviet territory. Their methods were simple and direct, since units entered towns, gathered Jewish residents with help from local police, marched them to pits or ravines, and shot them. Evidence from trials shows these units killed about 1.5 million Jews and other victims between 1941 and 1943 through direct shooting, a scale that remains staggering. Afterward, the SS chief visited an Einsatzgruppen elimination operation in August 1941. Longerich notes that Himmler watched about 100 people being shot, and he became visibly shaken, not from moral concern, but because the process seemed slow and mentally difficult for the executioners. This pushed Himmler to look for more efficient methods, since shooting would not handle the millions of victims he expected the SS to eliminate, and he wanted an approach that reduced strain on the killers while speeding the process. The competitive dynamic added urgency because Himmler knew other inner circle members were watching, and he needed to show the SS could manage the largest tasks with the most efficiency, turning deadly efficiency into a point of rivalry. Different SS leaders suggested options, and gas vans were tested by using exhaust fumes to kill victims locked inside, and while they worked, they were still too slow for the scale the SS chief envisioned. During this period, Goering gave formal approval for the final solution when he signed an order on July 31 in 1941, directing Heydrich to prepare a complete solution to the so-called Jewish question in German-controlled Europe. And this was not a detailed command from the Führer, but a political move in which Goering claimed credit for enabling the policy while leaving the actual execution to Himmler and Heydrich. Afterward, the security chief organized the Wannsee Conference in January 1942. This meeting brought officials from many government and SS offices together to coordinate the final solution, and it was not where the decision to remove Europe's Jews was made, since that choice had already grown from competition inside the inner circle. Wannsee focused on practical coordination by asking how agencies would work together, how people would be taken from different regions to killing centers, and what steps would guide the process to turn the mass crime into an organized system. Minutes from the meeting show talk about who would be killed at once and who would be forced to work first, and they discussed identification, transport, and what to do with bodies. And the plain administrative language hid the industrial killing they were planning. Heydrich showed his mix of firm belief and administrative skill by planning the deadly program with the same steady attention others used for train routes or factory work, and his method turned the killing into a a routine task inside the system. The meeting revealed how the inner circle carried out the Führer's vision, since he wanted Jews removed from Europe, and his subordinates competed to find the most efficient way, built the structure to do it, and carried out the mass killing. And each empire played a part as Himmler supplied the SS network, Heydrich coordinated it, the propaganda chief shaped opinion, Bormann handled paperwork, and Speer later used camp labor in war production. At this point, the death camp system represented the culmination of competitive radicalization. Between 1942 and 1945, 6 main killing centers operated in occupied Poland, including Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek, and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and each site was built for the industrial-scale removal of entire populations. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest and deadliest, and Overy notes that about 1.1 million people were killed there, most of them Jews, and the camp joined immediate killing in gas chambers with the temporary use of prisoner labor. The gas chambers used Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, and this proved more efficient than earlier methods because large groups could be killed quickly, and the bodies were burned in crematoria built for that purpose, and the entire process worked like a factory line. The SS chief designed, built, and operated these killing centers, and the organization that began with 280 guards in 1929 was now running industrial sites for mass killing, managing everything from transport to disposal. Records show that the camps worked with grim efficiency, since trains brought victims directly to the sites. SS doctors separated those who could work briefly from those killed at once, and the process from arrival to cremation took only hours, a scale and speed without precedent. Overall, the numbers reveal the systematic nature of the mass atrocity. Research using party records, survivor accounts, and demographic studies shows that about 6 million Jews were killed, with around 3 million dying in the killing centers and about 1.5 million shot by Einsatzgruppen, and the rest dying in ghettos, forced labor, deadly marches, or other harsh conditions. The mass atrocity also claimed millions of others, including about 3 million Soviet prisoners who died in captivity, more than 200,000 Roma and Sinti, about 250,000 disabled people in the T4 program, and many thousands of political prisoners, homosexuals, and others labeled undesirable. Kershaw notes that the total number of racial and political victims rose above 11 million, and this happened through organized actions carried out by the inner circles of competing empires. Himmler's SS killed millions through the Einsatzgruppen and the killing centers. The Air Force chief's economic system exploited victims and took their property. Goebbels prepared the public to accept the crimes, Bormann managed the paperwork, and Speer's factories worked countless forced laborers to death. Each empire supplied a needed part of the system, and the mass atrocity depended on belief, fear, propaganda, administration, and exploitation, all delivered by the inner circle through their competing structures. But the crimes extended beyond the mass atrocity. The inner circle's empires carried out crimes across occupied Europe beyond the mass killing of Jews, and they enforced occupation policies on purpose to brutalize and exploit the people they conquered. The Air Force chiefs' economic agencies stripped occupied regions of food, raw materials, equipment, and valuables, and Overy notes that this was not random looting but organized theft carried out through detailed administrative systems. In the occupied Soviet lands, these agencies seized food for German troops and civilians, and evidence shows the seizures were planned to cause starvation among Soviet civilians, following the belief that Germans would eat while slaves would starve. Research cited by Kershaw estimates that more than 4 million Soviet civilians died from starvation and deprivation caused by these policies, and this was not an accident of war, but a deliberate application of the belief system. Minutes from planning meetings show officials calmly calculating how many millions would die once food was taken, and they treated mass starvation as acceptable as long as Germans were fed, and the competitive dynamic inside the inner circle circle pushed them toward harsher measures to show ideological commitment. Similarly, Hans Frank's administration in occupied Poland exemplified a brutal occupation policy. Frank ruled the general government as a personal empire with little oversight, and he enforced policies meant to exploit Polish labor while stopping any resistance. Kershaw notes that Frank often boasted about his ruthlessness, saying Poles would work like slaves. And he spoke proudly of harsh actions against resistance as he tried to impress Hitler and compete with the SS chief for control of the region. His administration killed thousands of Poles for resistance, burned villages suspected of aiding partisans, and used hostage shootings as retaliation. And these actions went far beyond military need and served as terror based on racial beliefs. The inner circle encouraged this severity, since commanders who showed restraint risked being replaced by more radical officers, while those who used extreme measures gained praise and promotion, and the system steadily rewarded brutality. Speer's production empire added enormous crimes through forced labor, and by 1944, more than 7 million foreign workers served in Germany, including prisoners of war and civilians taken from occupied lands, and records show they received little food, poor shelter, and harsh treatment, and many who grew too weak were sent back to camps where they died or were killed. Thus, the system, on purpose, consumed human lives to produce weapons. The arms minister knew exactly what was happening, since he visited factories using forced labor, read reports on death rates, understood workers were being worked to death, and still expanded the programs because they produced results that increased his standing with the Führer. One example was the underground factory that produced V-2 rockets with concentration camp labor, and Overy notes that more than 20,000 prisoners died building the site and producing the rockets, meaning more people died making the weapons than were killed by them. Speer personally approved the Dora Mittelbau project, supplied resources, received production reports, and knew the death rates. Yet he continued the operation because it proved his ability to deliver results through ruthless efficiency. The crime went far beyond the use of forced labor, since the system, on purpose, worked people to death as expendable resources, and it treated human beings as material to be used up in production. Similar operations existed across German-controlled territory, where camp prisoners built factories, dug tunnels, made fortifications, and produced weapons, and hundreds of thousands died doing this work, leaving the arms minister's production empire built on their bodies. Meanwhile, Goebbels's propaganda empire enabled these crimes through psychological preparation. Goebbels used his campaigns to strip victims of their humanity before the killing began, and he portrayed Jews as dangerous parasites and Slavs as inferior beings. And this steady message prepared many Germans to accept later crimes. Welch notes that his propaganda repeated the same claims again and again, blaming Jews for the war, accusing them of conspiracy, and portraying them as deserving whatever happened. And this narrative made the mass atrocity seem justified to those who believed it. At the same time, Goebbels controlled information by blocking news from occupied lands, hiding details about the killing centers and shootings, and creating false stories to explain why Jews vanished from German life. This control was not complete, since many Germans heard reports from soldiers, saw dying forced laborers, or noticed people disappearing. Yet Goebbels offered explanations that encouraged the public to accept events and avoid difficult questions. The crime of the propaganda empire was enabling the mass killing through psychological manipulation, and although the propaganda chief did not kill people directly, his work prepared society to accept the violence and helped maintain silence while it happened, making him responsible for shaping the mental climate that allowed the mass atrocity. Similarly, Bormann's administrative empire created the bureaucratic infrastructure for crime. Bormann's offices processed the orders and communications that coordinated harsh treatment across occupied lands, and the paperwork that enabled the mass atrocity moved through his systems. Overy notes that the party chancellery handled correspondence on Jewish policy, forced labor, and occupation measures, and his staff drafted orders, sent directives, and monitored results, turning the crimes into routine administrative work. Bormann reviewed many documents himself, added notes, pushed actions he supported, and slowed those he disliked. And he acted as an active participant rather than a passive clerk. His administrative empire also controlled major financial resources, since his offices managed party funds that supported SS budgets, paid for new facilities and expanded programs, and the financial structure behind the harsh treatment flowed through his control. Most revealing was his role as the Führer's gatekeeper, because he decided who could see Hitler and what information reached him. And this allowed Bormann to shape the leader's understanding of how racial policies were carried out by stressing successes and hiding problems. Consequently, this made the party manager complicit in every crime the system committed. He knew what was happening because the reports crossed his desk, and he enabled the system by processing orders and giving administrative support, and he shaped it further by controlling what Hitler learned, which meant the bureaucratic machinery of the mass atrocity worked through his empire. Kershaw notes that the inner circle's crimes reached far beyond individual actions, since the entire occupation policy across Europe functioned as one massive crime, and research places the number of civilian deaths from party occupation, not counting battlefield losses, at more than 17 million. Within that number, about 6 million Jews were killed, around 3 million Soviet prisoners died in captivity, more than 4 million Soviet civilians died from occupation policies, over 200,000 Roma were killed, about 250,000 disabled people died in the T4 program, around 3 million non-Jewish Polish civilians were killed, and many thousands of others died because of resistance, political beliefs, or sexual orientation. This vast death toll grew from organized policies carried out by the inner circles of competing empires, and the scale required steady resources, coordination, and bureaucracy. The empires worked together to make it possible, even while they fought each other for influence. Ultimately, the competitive dynamic drove the death toll higher. Each inner circle member tried to show that his empire carried out the Führer's racial vision most effectively, and this competition rewarded extreme action, created pressure for constant escalation, and pushed aside any voice calling for restraint. When Himmler arrested 100,000 people, others felt they had to match that intensity, and when Speer increased production by working 50,000 prisoners to death, he set a new baseline that rivals felt obliged to exceed, and the cycle pushed policies toward greater brutality. They also competed for the Führer's approval by offering radical proposals, and they tried to guess what he wanted before he said it, then rushed to act first. And this anticipatory obedience meant he rarely needed to give detailed instructions. Kershaw stresses that this pattern of competitive radicalization shaped the entire mass atrocity, since it did not grow from precise orders reluctantly obeyed, but from inner circle members proving their ideological drive and administrative skill through ever harsher measures. Each major escalation reflected this rivalry, since the shift from harsh treatment to killing, the move to gas chambers, the creation of killing centers, and the expansion to all Jews in occupied Europe all came from officials proposing more extreme steps to show superior commitment. As a result, this pattern appeared across all their crimes. The starvation policies in the occupied Soviet lands grew as the Air Force chief and others competed to show ruthless efficiency. The slave labor system expanded as Speer tried to prove his production strength, and the propaganda intensified as Goebbels worked to show his ideological reliability. These crimes were not unfortunate excesses in a normal war, since they formed the core purpose of the occupation, and the inner circle planned them, supplied resources, organized the work, and competed to show they could carry out mass killing most effectively. Kershaw explains that this competitive dynamic is central to understanding the mass atrocity because it required more than the Führer's will and the belief system, and it depended on powerful men using their empires to turn ideas into the systematic killing of people, supported by bureaucracy, propaganda, and economic exploitation. The inner circle supplied each part of this system, and their empires made the mass atrocity possible, while their competition pushed it forward, as every member tried to prove he was the most loyal and effective by driving harsher measures. Even while they fought over authority, resources, and access to Hitler, they remained united on the core goals, since they accepted the racial belief system and agreed the agenda had to be carried out without restraint. And this unity made the outcome unavoidable. This unity in purpose, despite competition for power, made them extraordinarily dangerous. A united inner circle might have threatened the Führer, but a competing one pushed its ambition toward carrying out his vision, and the system he built turned their rivalry into an engine for escalating crime. The crimes continued until the regime's collapse in May 1945, and the inner circle never slowed or softened the policies, since only military defeat stopped the killing, and given more time, the death toll would have risen even higher. Overy notes that they discussed even larger plans, since Himmler imagined SS settlements across the east and Rosenberg proposed vast population removals, and these ideas were so extreme that only defeat prevented their full implementation. The crimes carried out between 1939 and 1945 mark one of the darkest periods in human history, as 6 years of racial belief put into action produced deaths on a scale that defies understanding, with about 17 million civilians killed by deliberate policy and millions more lost in the conflict the regime created. These were not abstract totals, since each number represented a life ended by systematic killing, with families destroyed, communities wiped out, and entire groups targeted. And the vast scale becomes clear only when we see how these men organized it and made it possible. Ultimately, the inner circle's responsibility is absolute and undeniable. They were not minor officials following orders, since they designed the mass atrocity, built the systems, coordinated the work, and competed to show who could kill most effectively. The SS chief led the machine that killed millions. The Air Force chief signed approvals and drove exploitation. Goebbels shaped public opinion. Bormann managed the paperwork, and the arms minister worked countless forced laborers to death, and each carried personal responsibility while all shared collective guilt. Their rivalry pushed policies to the extreme, their empires supplied the means for large-scale killing, and their belief system removed any restraint, turning their competition into death for millions. Kershaw notes that their crimes reveal how authoritarian systems operate, where power rests in competing empires. Loyalty is proved through extreme action, beliefs excuse any measure, and rivalry rewards brutality, creating one of history's greatest crimes. By this point, as the regime fell and their empires collapsed, their last choices showed how deeply they remained tied to the belief system that shaped them, and these final actions led directly into the legacy they left behind. Section 5. The Legacy. By early 1945, the regime was collapsing as Allied forces pushed in from both sides. Cities were in ruins from bombing, and the empires built by the inner circle were falling apart while their crimes approached full exposure. The situation became hopeless by spring, since Soviet troops reached Berlin in April while American and British troops controlled the West, and the Führer's authority had shrunk to a small area around his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Overy notes that Hitler spent his final days in this bunker, where the leader who once commanded vast armies now held almost no real power. Several members of the inner circle stayed with him until the end, and Bormann kept processing paperwork for a government that barely existed, while Goebbels remained in the bunker with his family, even though his propaganda network had collapsed and his devotion to the Führer was all he had left. Hermann, the Air Force chief, took a different course, since on April 23rd, he sent a message from southern Germany asking for authority to take over leadership, revealing a self-serving move rather than loyalty. As a result, the leader responded with fury. Hitler ordered the Air Force chief arrested for treason, and Göring's military and economic empires collapsed at once. since the man who had been second in the hierarchy for 12 years lost everything with a single message, and his attempt to save his own power ended what remained of his position. Himmler also tried to negotiate with the Western Allies by meeting Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte, and Overy notes that he believed he might be accepted as a legitimate partner, even though he carried direct responsibility for millions of deaths. This reveal of stunning delusion came from a man who had built the SS system and organized the mass atrocity, yet he acted as if he were a normal official rather than its architect. And when Hitler learned of this, he ordered Himmler removed from all positions, ending the SS empire he had built over 16 years. Speer left Berlin before the final collapse and spent the last weeks traveling through German-held areas, supposedly carrying out Hitler's orders to destroy German infrastructure, though evidence suggests he worked quietly to stop the destruction while pretending to follow instructions. This later allowed the arms minister to claim he opposed the scorched earth policy and tried to save the country. And Speer used this story to present himself as a technocrat who rejected Hitler's madness. Yet research shows this claim was largely a false self-defense. By April 30, 1945, Hitler took his own life. While Soviet forces fought in nearby streets, the Führer took his own life, and before doing so, he married Eva Braun and dictated a final testament blaming Jews for the war and Germany's defeat, showing that even in his last moments, he would not accept responsibility. Goebbels stayed devoted until the end, and on May 1st, he and his wife ended the lives of their 6 children with poison and then took their own lives, because the propaganda chief could not imagine living without the Führer or letting his children live in a world where the regime had fallen. This act revealed his complete fanaticism, since most parents try to protect their children, yet Goebbels killed his own rather than let them survive the regime's collapse, proving his loyalty to Hitler and the belief system outweighed even parental love. Martin, the party manager, attempted to escape Berlin as Soviet forces closed in, and records suggest he fled the bunker on May 1 or 2, and his body was found years later, showing he likely died during the escape, possibly after taking his own life when capture seemed certain. Bormann's administrative empire disappeared the moment Hitler died, since the paperwork systems that gave him power meant nothing once the state collapsed, and his influence vanished because it depended entirely on the party structure staying intact. Meanwhile, the other inner circle members faced different fates as the regime collapsed. The Air Force chief was captured by American forces in Bavaria in May 1945, and unlike the SS chief or the propaganda chief, he wanted to survive and seemed to believe he could talk his way out of responsibility, and accounts describe him as relaxed and friendly with his captors at first. Himmler tried to escape by posing as a common soldier, shaving his mustache and wearing an eye patch to hide his identity, but British forces caught him at a checkpoint on May 23, 1945, and when they discovered who he was, he took his own life by biting a hidden poison capsule. His decision to avoid justice showed his weakness, since the man who ordered millions killed and built an empire of terror refused to face the results of his actions, choosing death rather than accountability, which matched his pattern of being ruthless in power and fearful when confronted with consequences. Albert, the arms minister, surrendered to Allied forces and quickly began shaping his post-war image by claiming he was only an architect and production manager who had little knowledge of the mass atrocity, and later opposed the Führer's destructive final orders. Tooze shows this story was a crafted deception, since Speer knew about the mass killing, used forced labor, knowing workers were being worked to death, and joined party crimes willingly. Yet his later claims focused on his technical skill while hiding his ideological ties and criminal actions. With the regime's collapse, the crimes could no longer be hidden. When Allied forces liberated the camps, they found evidence of crimes far beyond what most people thought possible, and they walked into scenes filled with starving survivors, mass graves, gas chambers, and crematoria, making the organized nature of the mass killing impossible to dismiss. Although many soldiers had heard rumors about the regime's actions, Overy explains that the reality stunned them, since what they witnessed went far beyond anything they had imagined. Because he feared future denial, Eisenhower ordered the camps to be documented in full, and he required photographs, written reports, and even forced local German civilians to walk through the sites so they could see what had been carried out in their name. Among the ruins, Allied investigators discovered records that revealed how the mass killing had been organized, and these papers, found in offices and camp buildings, linked names to orders and showed a clear trail of approvals and reports. From these documents, investigators confirmed that the SS chief ran the killing centers, the security chief coordinated the Wannsee Plan, the Air Force chief approved key measures, the party manager handled the communications, and the arms minister relied heavily on camp labor, leaving a complete picture of their responsibilities. Clearly, the discovery also showed the crime's enormous scale. About 6 million Jews had been killed, and millions of others died in camps, from forced labor, through mass shootings, and under occupation policies, which meant the death toll from racial and political harsh treatment rose to more than 11 million civilians, not counting battlefield losses. Researchers established these totals by drawing on several kinds of evidence. Since party records tracked transports to killing centers, demographic studies revealed the disappearance of entire communities. Survivor testimony described the deadly operations in detail, and all sources pointed to the same devastating numbers. As investigators studied the documents, they saw how inner circle competition pushed policies toward greater extremity because officials suggested harsher measures, wrote reports praising their own efficiency in killing, and sent communications meant to show their ideological commitment through increasingly deadly action. The paper trail made it clear this was not reluctant bureaucracy at work, since the inner circle and their assistants actively competed to carry out the mass killing, and the documents showed eagerness rather than hesitation and pride in efficiency rather than shame. During these investigations, Allied forces uncovered Goebbels' directives, ordering the media to justify harsh treatment, found the Air Force chief's instructions for economic plunder, located Bormann's administrative messages coordinating policies across occupied lands, and recovered the arms minister's requests for forced labor while he knew many workers would die. But the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. As the war ended, the question became how to hold the surviving inner circle members accountable, since traditional legal systems had never faced crimes of this scale. Yet the Allied powers agreed that justice had to be carried out. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg created a process unlike anything before it, and it judged leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, beginning its work in November 1945, only months after the regime's defeat. Lead American prosecutor and author Telford Taylor notes that 24 defendants were indicted, including surviving members of the Inner Circle and other top officials, and the court's goal was to assign individual responsibility rather than claim collective guilt. Hermann Göring was the highest-ranking surviving party leader, and he faced charges that ranged from planning aggressive war to crimes against humanity, and the evidence linked him to the creation of camps, the economic plunder of occupied lands, and orders that supported harsh treatment. During the trial, he defended himself forcefully by denying personal responsibility and claiming he served national interests. Yet Taylor explains that the prosecution brought forward extensive documents and witnesses that connected him to planning crimes, organizing exploitation, and approving actions that contributed to mass killing. This led to Goering being convicted on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. Goering cheated the hangman, since on October 15, 1946, he took his own life only hours before his scheduled death sentence, and historian Michael Maris notes that historians still debate how he obtained the poison and kept it hidden during months in prison. Even in death, The Air Force chief tried to stay in control and avoid justice, and his choice to take his own life showed a final act of defiance, since he refused to accept responsibility and held to party beliefs to the end. Speer's trial revealed the defense he had long prepared, as he accepted general responsibility while denying knowledge of the mass killing, and he tried to present himself as someone misled by the Führer who eventually saw the regime's true nature. The evidence shown in court contradicted this story because documents placed him at meetings where killing policies were discussed. Records proved he requested camp labor knowing prisoners were worked to death, and testimony linked him directly to criminal programs. Even so, he kept repeating his claims, admitting he used forced labor while insisting he knew nothing about the killing centers and saying he focused only on production, but the tribunal still convicted him of war crimes and crimes against humanity and sentenced him to 20 years in prison, a far lighter punishment than others with similar responsibility received. Ultimately, the arms minister's relative leniency resulted partly from his carefully maintained image. Speer appeared cooperative and remorseful in ways other defendants did not, and he accepted limited responsibility while denying knowledge of the worst crimes. Because he shared details about weapons production, the tribunal viewed him as less guilty than the ideological loyalists. Maris explains that the tribunal was misled, since Speer knew far more than he admitted, and his use of forced labor was deliberate and widespread. His actions matched those who received death sentences, yet his careful performance earned him a lighter punishment. Other defendants received different sentences based on individual roles. Some were killed, others received long prison terms, and a few were acquitted when evidence was insufficient, which showed that the trials focused on personal guilt rather than condemning the entire nation. The Nuremberg trials created major precedents in international law by proving that following orders does not excuse crimes against humanity, confirming personal responsibility for deliberate killing and abuse, and establishing that aggressive war and organized mass killing violate basic human principles. However, the trials also revealed the limits of justice for such vast crimes. Since no sentence could restore millions of lives, prison terms felt small compared to the scale of harm, and true justice for the victims was impossible because nothing could undo what had been done. As a result, the trials documented the inner circle's crimes for history. Testimony, documents, and evidence entered the record established clear facts about party atrocities. This documentation became essential for preventing historical denial and educating future generations about what happened. Through these proceedings, the workings of the inner circle's competitive system became visible, since the evidence showed how rivalry pushed policies toward greater extremity. Testimony described their eagerness to prove ideological commitment, and documents revealed the organized way they carried out the mass killing. The trials proved these acts were not random wartime violence, but deliberate policies created through planning and systematic coordination, and the inner circle did not follow orders reluctantly, but competed to carry out the Führer's vision as fully as possible. This distinction is essential for understanding how the mass atrocity happened, because it required willing participants at every level, from administrators who organized transport, to guards who ran camps, to officials who signed orders, and the system worked because people chose to participate rather than being forced. The inner circle carried the greatest responsibility, since they created and directed the system, built the empires that enabled mass killing, shaped the competition that drove escalation, and turned the belief system into a deadly program that ended millions of lives. But the inner circle's legacy extends beyond their individual fates. The inner circle's actions shaped history in ways still felt decades later, and understanding their legacy helps prevent similar tragedies by showing how authoritarian systems work and how ordinary people can be drawn into large evil. Overy explains that the mass atrocity became the most systematically organized mass killing in history, and although oppression appears throughout human experience, the regime's deadly program was unique for its industrial efficiency, its bureaucratic design, and its reach across an entire continent. This level of systematization grew directly from the empires the inner circle built, since Himmler's SS supplied the killing apparatus, Heydrich handled the logistics, Goebbels shaped public acceptance, the party manager processed the paperwork, and the arms minister absorbed forced labor into production, and each empire provided an essential part of the whole. Because competition shaped their actions, the system kept moving toward harsher measures, and each member tried to show a stronger commitment through extreme acts, pushing aside restraint and encouraging proposals that were more radical than the last. Through this process, the competitive dynamic turned belief into action and drove the mass killing to a scale the world had never seen, leaving a legacy that warns how such systems can grow when powerful men compete for influence by proving their loyalty through brutality. This dynamic provides lessons about authoritarian systems. First, concentrating power in competing empires creates conditions for radicalization, and when leaders try to win a dictator's favor through extreme action, policies can escalate toward maximum brutality, since the competition wipes out the normal checks that keep political systems restrained. Second, beliefs mixed with power open the door to crimes that would otherwise be unthinkable because the inner circle truly believed their ideology of superiority, and this belief gave them a sense of moral purpose, turning the deliberate killing of entire groups into what they told themselves was a mission rather than a crime. Third, bureaucratic skill makes such beliefs even more dangerous, not less guilty. Because the SS chief's organizational ability, the security chief's administrative efficiency, and Speer's technical skill allowed crimes to grow to a scale that would have been impossible without their talents. And competence used for evil remains evil. Fourth, loyalty to a leader can override every moral limit, and the propaganda chief's devotion drove him to end the lives of his own children rather than live after the regime's fall, while Bormann continued paperwork routines as the state collapsed, showing how personal loyalty became more important than decency or even survival. Fifth, ordinary people enabled these crimes through cooperation, since the mass killing needed thousands of clerks to process documents, railway workers to move victims, and guards to run camps, and most who participated were everyday individuals who chose to comply rather than resist. Historical research has examined why ordinary Germans participated in mass atrocity. Some people acted from ideological conviction and believed the party's racial ideas, while others joined in for career gains by showing strong commitment, and many complied out of fear of the results for resisting, while countless others obeyed authority without questioning the orders they received. As these motives mixed together, participation soon felt normal, and the slow escalation made each new step seem smaller than the one before it, while the bureaucratic routines made killing feel like another task. Propaganda offered justifications, and the harsh results for resisting discouraged anyone from standing against the system. This pattern reveals something troubling about human nature, because ordinary people can take part in great evil when certain pressures exist, including authoritarian control, ideological excuses, bureaucratic routines, gradual escalation, and fear of what might happen if they refuse. The inner circle created all these conditions on purpose. Since their empires applied authoritarian pressure, their beliefs supplied justification, their paperwork systems normalized the actions, their rivalry pushed escalation, and their terror network punished anyone who tried to resist. Understanding this system helps reveal the warning signs, since when power gathers in competing empires that answer only to a single leader, radicalization becomes likely. And when beliefs excuse any measure against chosen enemies and bureaucratic routines make deadly actions seem ordinary, more people become willing to take part. Therefore, modern applications of these lessons require vigilance. Authoritarian movements still appear in ways that echo these patterns, since they gather power in loyal assistance, build competing centers that answer only to the leader, promote beliefs that justify violence against chosen enemies, and reward extreme action while treating restraint as weakness. Recognizing such patterns makes early resistance possible because protecting institutions that limit power stops its concentration in personal empires. Rejecting messages that dehumanize others removes moral excuses for violence, and supporting independent groups creates places where resistance can grow. Another part of the Inner Circle's legacy is the example of holding leaders accountable, since the Nuremberg trials proved that political and military leaders carry personal responsibility for crimes against humanity, and that following orders cannot excuse mass killing or abuse. This principle has shaped international law ever since. As the International Criminal Court prosecutes crimes against humanity, special tribunals address abuses in specific conflicts, and the idea of individual responsibility for organized brutality became a widely accepted legal standard. However, this principle is not always applied, since many people involved in mass killing or other abuses still avoid prosecution, and political interests often block accountability, meaning the standard set at Nuremberg remains uneven in practice. Ultimately, the Inner Circle's story shows how evil succeeds through the choices people make. Hitler provided the vision and shaped the system, but his Inner Circle chose to compete in carrying it out through ever more extreme measures, and thousands of officials chose to join the mass killing, while millions of ordinary Germans chose compliance instead of resistance. These were choices rather than unavoidable results, because people could have refused to take part. Officials could have stepped down instead of enforcing criminal orders, and citizens could have opposed harsh treatment, and each person carried responsibility for the decisions they made. The mass atrocity happened because people chose to make it happen, and the Inner Circle held special responsibility since their choices mattered most, and their drive to build empires, compete for influence, and enforce the belief system killed millions. Accepting their responsibility does not reduce Hitler's guilt, since he created the system and set the overall direction. But focusing only on him hides how the system worked, because the Inner Circle's rivalry turned his ideas into a deadly program carried out step by step. This distinction matters for prevention, since stopping future mass killing requires understanding not only dictators but also the structures that support them, recognizing how competing power centers push radicalization, and seeing how ordinary administrative skill can enable large evil. Now, their legacy includes the documentation enabling historical memory. Hilberg notes that the extensive records created by the Inner Circle, when combined with survivor testimony and Allied documentation, provide detailed evidence of what happened. And because of this evidence, honest examination makes denial impossible. Even though some people deny the mass killing, their claims collapse when compared with the documentary record, and the Inner Circle's own thorough paperwork ironically preserved clear proof of their crimes, since the paper trails they produced marked their guilt. This documentation serves vital educational purposes because teaching about the mass atrocity shows what humans can do under certain conditions, explains why human rights must be defended, warns against dehumanizing beliefs, and demonstrates the importance of institutions that limit power. The memory of the mass killing still shapes how societies think about human rights and accountability, and the phrase "never again" expresses a commitment to prevent similar tragedies, a commitment that grows from understanding what the Inner Circle achieved through their competing empires. However, mass killing has continued in places like Rwanda, Bosnia, and Cambodia, and these latter tragedies show that the lessons were not learned everywhere, since the warning signs revealed by the Inner Circle system have not prevented all similar crimes. This reveals the difficulty of translating historical knowledge into prevention. Knowing how the mass atrocity happened offers important insight, yet this knowledge alone does not automatically stop similar dangers from appearing elsewhere. because authoritarian movements can still gather power in loyal assistance, and belief systems can still dehumanize chosen enemies, while ordinary people may again participate under certain pressures. Effective prevention requires more than information, since it depends on constant vigilance, and it calls for protecting democratic institutions, resisting authoritarian behavior, and challenging harmful rhetoric that targets vulnerable groups, while citizens must be willing to oppose immoral policies rather than comply with them. The Inner Circle story serves as both a warning and an instruction, because the warning shows how quickly a system can slide into mass atrocity when power grows without limits, and the instruction reveals the specific mechanisms that push their actions toward increasing brutality. Their legacy rests in the millions who died and the suffering they caused, and it also rests in the efforts made after the war to hold leaders accountable, since accountability became an essential response to the crimes they directed. Most importantly, their legacy includes the vast documentation that preserves historical memory, along with the lasting lessons about how authoritarian systems operate and how ordinary people can enable great evil. A reminder that these dangers return whenever societies stop paying attention. And this legacy requires examining each Inner Circle member's ultimate fate and historical verdict. Himmler took his own life to avoid facing justice, and this showed his fear when he finally met the results of the violence he ordered. And his SS empire disappeared the moment the leader died because it depended completely on the party system. Goering tried to take power once Hitler was trapped, and this showed his selfish ambition, while his later choice to take his own life instead of facing punishment showed he would not accept blame, and his military and economic empires collapsed because they were built on stolen resources and poor decisions. Goebbels stayed loyal to Hitler until the very end, and he ended his children's lives and his own rather than live after the party's defeat. His propaganda empire vanished once he lost control of the news and radio, which proved his loyalty to the leader was stronger than his duty as a parent. Bormann tried to escape Berlin but died during the attempt, and the administrative empire he created meant nothing once the government collapsed, since his influence came only from the party offices and not from personal strength or talent. The arms minister later created a story claiming he had limited responsibility and even tried to oppose the leader, and although he served 20 years in prison, he spent the rest of his life repeating this excuse. Yet historical research has shown it was false, and his lighter punishment revealed how convincing behavior can hide serious guilt. Though each faced different ends, all bore responsibility for the deaths of millions. Their competing empires made the mass atrocity possible, and their beliefs removed moral limits, while their administrative skill made the killings efficient, and their rivalry pushed them toward greater brutality until millions died. History's judgment is clear. Since the Inner Circle were war criminals with direct responsibility for the mass atrocity and other crimes, and they were not minor workers obeying orders, but the planners and organizers who carried the system out. Their story matters because it shows how authoritarian systems grow, and it explains how loyalty to one leader can replace basic morality while competing power centers encourage extreme action, and ordinary administrative talent becomes a tool for great harm. The lessons remain urgent because the same forces can appear anywhere, and authoritarian movements still rise, dehumanizing beliefs still spread, and loyal circles still form around powerful leaders, leaving ordinary people to decide whether to resist or comply. And this is how to recognize and resist these patterns. It means defending institutions that limit power, and it means rejecting beliefs that turn people into enemies, while also resisting the slow acceptance of cruelty and choosing courage over compliance when governments pursue immoral policies. The Inner Circle's legacy is ultimately about human choices and their results, because these men chose to build empires, compete for influence, and carry out mass atrocities, and thousands of officials chose to assist, while millions of ordinary Germans chose compliance or active help. These choices ended millions of lives and destroyed entire families and communities, and they created suffering on a scale that is difficult to grasp, proving how systematic evil becomes possible when the right conditions meet the wrong decisions. But the story also shows that resistance existed, since some officials refused to participate, some citizens protected intended victims, and some soldiers disobeyed criminal orders, which proves that even inside an authoritarian system, people still carry moral responsibility and can choose humanity over beliefs. The inner circle story becomes a warning about what can happen when power grows without restraint, when beliefs justify any measure against chosen enemies, when bureaucracy turns cruelty into normal procedure, and when ordinary people choose compliance over resistance, and their legacy demands constant vigilance and active defense of human dignity. This is how Hitler's inner circle amplified his worst ambitions into industrial-scale evil, and it teaches us that preventing such tragedies requires more than remembering history. It requires noticing warning signs when they appear in our own time, and it demands protecting the institutions and values that limit authoritarian behavior while calling on citizens to resist rather than comply when power gathers in one place and beliefs begin to dehumanize. The empires may be gone, as well as the men, yet the lessons about how authoritarian systems create mass atrocity through competing centers of power remain urgent, because the same forces can appear anywhere that power grows without checks. Beliefs excuse violence, and ordinary people choose compliance instead of moral resistance. Understanding these dynamics shows how easily concentrated power turns into organized brutality. However, to know more about one of Hitler's closest allies' private life, check this video next.